Imagine standing at the edge of a forest somewhere in northern Ontario. The trees are old here, not old the way a neighborhood oak is old, standing in someone's backyard for 150 years. Old in a way that makes your chest feel strange. The kind of old where you can sense in the silence that something was here long before any name was put to this land. The ground beneath your boots is uneven, not because of roots or rocks in any ordinary arrangement, but because of something that runs in a line, a deliberate, intentional line, stretching from where you stand all the way into the tree line and beyond, disappearing into the shadows of the spruce and the birch as if it were pointing at something that no longer exists, or perhaps at something that never stopped existing. You kneel down, you press your palm flat against the earth. The soil is cold. It always is up here, even in summer. Even when the air above is warm enough to bring out the black flies and the mosquitoes and the particular golden light that settles over the boreal in July. But beneath the cold, there is something else, a shape, a geometry that does not belong to any process you learnt about in school. The raised ridge of earth runs too straight for a glacial deposit. The stones arranged along its edge are too evenly spaced for an accident of frost heave or flood. And when you pull back and look at it from the hillside above, from the height that only a satellite or a very curious researcher with permission and a drone can reach, the shape of it stops your breath. It is not a mound. It is not a wall. It is not quite any single thing that has a name in the official record of Canadian archaeology. And that is precisely the problem. Because this country, this vast and ancient country that stretches from the Atlantic to the Pacific to the Arctic Ocean, is full of structures like this, structures that do not fit. Structures that predate the arrival of every civilization that history has officially acknowledged as having been here. Structures built by hands that no curriculum has ever named, placed according to patterns that no textbook has yet explained, and preserved in silence by the deep cold and the deep forest, and the deep institutional reluctance of scholars who have spent their careers building a picture of North America's past, that these stones, these earthworks, these tunnels and cairns and petroglyphs quietly, patiently, and completely contradict. This is not a story about conspiracy theories. This is not a story about aliens or lost continents in the Hollywood sense. This is a story about what happens when the evidence refuses to obey the timeline that was assigned to it. It is a story about what happens when the ground speaks, and the official record does not want to listen. It is a story about Canada, the forgotten Canada, the Canada that existed for thousands of years before anyone thought to write its history down, and the mysterious structures, some buried, some underwater, some sitting in plain sight on the surface of the land, that raise questions so uncomfortable that the easiest response has always been to simply not ask them. We are going to ask them tonight. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. There is something about the long, slow wait of prehistory, the kind that goes back not centuries but millennia, that has always been the most natural companion to the edge of sleep. The mind loosens when the timescale extends. The urgent present recedes. What remains is older and quieter and stranger than anything the news cycle contains. Canada's hidden history is exactly that kind of story. Old enough to be dreamlike, real enough to matter, and unresolved enough that your mind can move freely inside it, following the mystery wherever it goes in the dark. Maybe subscribe and let me know, where are you right now and what time is it? The thing that makes Canada unusual in the global conversation about ancient mysteries is not that it has one or two anomalous sites that don't fit the accepted narrative. Almost every country has those. What makes Canada unusual is the sheer scale and variety of the anomalies, and the way they cluster in patterns that suggest not isolated incidents, but something systemic. Something that was here, all across this land, doing something that we still cannot fully describe, long before the dates that conventional archaeology has assigned to the arrival of complex civilization in the Western Hemisphere. Start with the land itself. Canada is enormous. It is the second largest country on Earth by total area, covering nearly 10 million square kilometers. And for most of its length, it is either very cold, very remote, very forested, very wet, or some combination of all four. This is not incidental to the mystery, it is central to it. The very conditions that make Canada difficult to inhabit in the modern sense are also the conditions that have preserved things. Ice preserves, permafrost preserves, dense boreal forest that has not been cleared for agriculture preserves. The Canadian Shield, that vast ancient expanse of Precambrian rock that underlies most of central and eastern Canada, is one of the oldest exposed geological formations on the surface of the Earth, and it has been doing a very quiet, very patient job of holding things in place for a very long time. When researchers and amateur archaeologists and curious locals began finding strange structures across this landscape in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the initial response from institutional archaeology was predictable. Natural formations, they said, glacial activity, frost heave, indigenous construction of a kind already documented and understood. The paperwork was filed, the sites were catalogued with minimal interest, and the questions they raised were quietly set aside in favor of the more comfortable work of filling in a timeline that had already been decided. But some of the people who found these things were not satisfied with those explanations, and as decades passed, and as new technologies emerged that could date organic material trapped in earthworks, and as satellite imaging revealed patterns that ground-level observers could never have detected, and as the emerging field of archaeoastronomy began to realize that some of these structures were aligned with celestial events in ways too precise to be accidental, the questions began to accumulate faster than the comfortable explanations could address them. Let's begin in the West. Because the western edge of Canada, the long corrugated coast of British Columbia, with its inlets and islands and fjords, is where some of the oldest and most difficult to explain evidence has emerged. Not from a single dramatic discovery, but from the slow accumulation of many small ones, each unremarkable on its own, but forming a pattern when you step back far enough to see the whole thing. The coast of British Columbia has been inhabited for an extraordinarily long time. This is not contested. The presence of Indigenous peoples along this coast stretches back at least 14,000 years by the most conservative estimates, and many researchers believe the human presence extends considerably further than that. What is contested, and what has produced some genuinely startling disagreements within the academic community, is what those people were doing over all those thousands of years, and whether they were doing it alone. In the 1970s, a researcher named Selwyn Dewdney began documenting something that the residents of the BC interior had always known about: the petroglyphs, rock carvings, images pressed or pecked into the surfaces of stone outcrops by hands and tools that left no other record. The petroglyphs of British Columbia are not news to anyone who has spent time in the interior. They appear along riverbanks, on the faces of cliffs above ancient travel routes, on the shores of lakes that have been fished and paddled for generations beyond counting. The Coast Salish people, the Interior Salish, the Nlaka'pamux, the Secwepemc, all have cultural connections to these images, oral traditions that speak of them, stories that place their creation within a framework of meaning and purpose. But Dewdney noticed something that the cultural frameworks did not fully account for. Some of the petroglyphs, not all of them, not even most of them, but a distinct and consistent subset of them, bore resemblances to symbols found in other places. Very distant places, places that had no known connection to the Canadian interior. Images that looked, with a disturbing and specific similarity, like the cosmological symbols of pre-contact cultures from across the Pacific, and not the loose, interpretable similarities that allow you to see a face in almost any arrangement of curves and marks, but tight, structured, repeated symbolic complexes that showed up in the same configurations, the same relationships, the same grammatical arrangements, on rock faces in coastal British Columbia, and on temple walls in what is now Vietnam, Japan, and Indonesia. This could be coincidence. Similar environments produce similar symbolic needs, and humans across cultures have independently arrived at similar visual vocabularies before. The circle, the spiral, the figure with raised arms, these appear in rock art around the world because they correspond to universal human experiences: the sun, growth, worship, the body. You do not need trans-Pacific contact to explain a circle carved into a rock. But some of the BC petroglyphs were not circles. They were something more specific, something that required a conceptual framework that most archaeologists were not prepared to attribute to isolated coastal populations working without outside influence. And the question of what they meant, and who taught the knowledge that produced them, and what structures were built by the same people who made them, has never been satisfactorily resolved. Because the petroglyphs were not the only thing, alongside the carvings, researchers began finding another category of evidence entirely: physical structures. Not the post and beam longhouses of the historic coastal peoples, not the pit houses of the interior, but something different in kind: earthworks, stone arrangements, features of the landscape that showed evidence of deliberate construction, but that did not fit comfortably within any architectural tradition that archaeologists had assigned to pre-contact British Columbia. Some of these were simple cairns, piles of stones too carefully arranged to be accidental, placed at intervals along routes that, when mapped, turned out to follow the same corridors that later indigenous trade networks used, and that even later European explorers described as established pathways through the terrain. The cairns marked something, they guided someone, and the question of who built the first ones and how long ago is not one that the official record has answered in any satisfying way. Others were more complex. In the interior valleys of BC, particularly along the Fraser River and its tributaries, there are earthen features that have been interpreted, when they were interpreted at all, as fish weirs or irrigation features associated with the intensive root harvesting practices of the interior Salish, and some of them probably are. But some of them are oriented in ways that do not correspond to any agricultural or fishing logic. They run uphill rather than downhill. They are arrayed in configurations that seem to respond to the landscape in a pattern that is astronomical rather than agricultural. They point at horizon positions that correspond to the rising and setting of specific stars at specific times of year, the same times of year when traditional harvests and ceremonies were held, suggesting a level of intentional, astronomical orientation that most pre-contact North American sites are not supposed to contain. The phrase "not supposed to" is doing a lot of work in the history of Canadian archaeology. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. The word "supposed" implies a framework that someone constructed, a set of expectations that someone assigned to the past before the past was fully examined. And the structures in British Columbia, taken together with what has been found elsewhere in Canada, suggest that the framework that was assigned to this land's pre-contact history may have been assembled too quickly, with too little evidence, and with too many assumptions imported from a European perspective that did not know how to account for what was actually here. Let us go east now. East to the Great Prairies, to the enormous flat interior of the continent where the sky dominates and the land beneath it is, or appears to be, featureless. Because the prairies of Canada are not featureless. They never were. And the evidence of what was here before the buffalo herds and the homesteaders and the railroad cuts across the flatness in circles and lines and geometric arrangements that are, when you understand what you are looking at, among the most extraordinary pre-contact monuments in the entire Western Hemisphere. Medicine wheels. The term is a relatively recent European coinage applied to a category of stone structure found across the northern Great Plains that does not map comfortably onto any single cultural tradition or any simple functional explanation. The largest and most famous of the Canadian examples is the Majorville Cairn and Medicine Wheel in southern Alberta, located on a windswept hill above the Bow River Valley where it has been sitting, slowly being buried and occasionally re-exposed by wind and erosion, for an amount of time that is still being argued about, but that the most careful dating work suggests is somewhere between 4,500 and 5,000 years old. 5,000 years old. Think about what was happening in the world 5,000 years ago. The Great Pyramid of Giza was not yet built. The city of Ur in Mesopotamia was barely a century old. The stone circles at Avebury in England were under construction. Troy, the legendary city of Homer, would not be founded for another 1,000 years. And on a hill in what is now Alberta, someone was laying out a circular stone arrangement 100 meters across, with a central cairn built up over generations from thousands of individually carried stones, and spokes radiating outward from the center to the rim in a pattern that, when the site is aligned correctly, lines up with the rising positions of specific stars on the summer solstice horizon. The Majorville Wheel is not alone. There are dozens of medicine wheels documented across the Canadian prairies, concentrated in Alberta and Saskatchewan, with a few examples in Manitoba and 1 or 2 documented cases in British Columbia. They vary in size and complexity. Some are simple cairns with a ring of stones around them. Others have multiple rings, complex spoke arrangements, and outlying cairns placed at distances that seem to correspond to specific astronomical measurements. The largest of them required the organized effort of many people working over extended periods of time, hauling and placing stones that sometimes weigh hundreds of pounds across terrain where there was no natural source of the rock used. Who built them? The short, frustrating, and completely honest answer is that we do not know with certainty. Indigenous oral traditions, from the Plains cultures, the Blackfoot, the Cree, the Assiniboine, the Nakota, speak of the medicine wheels as ancient, as having been here before living memory, before the memory of the elders. This is itself significant information. When the transmitted oral history of a culture places a structure outside its own historical memory, that is a form of dating. It is not precise in the way a carbon sample is precise, but it is meaningful. It suggests that whoever built the first medicine wheels, they were doing so long enough before the cultures whose territory they now occupy that those cultures had lost the direct connection to the building. Some researchers have argued for a direct link between the medicine wheel builders and the historical Plains cultures, suggesting that the structures were built incrementally by successive peoples over thousands of years, each adding to what previous generations had started, each maintaining and modifying structures whose original purposes had been partially transformed by time and cultural change. This is plausible. There is evidence of multiple construction episodes at several medicine wheel sites, of stones moved and replaced and added to across long spans of time. But it does not explain the astronomical alignments. It does not explain why the spokes of the Majorville wheel point, with an accuracy that professional astronomers have verified, to the rising positions of Aldebaran, Rigel, and Sirius on the summer solstice horizon at the latitude of southern Alberta, calculated for a date approximately 4,000 years in the past. It does not explain why the same alignment logic appears independently at medicine wheel sites spread across hundreds of kilometers of prairie, as if the builders of all these sites shared a common body of knowledge about stellar positions and calendar reckoning that was sophisticated enough to be called an astronomical system. The concept of a pre-contact astronomical system on the Canadian prairies is not one that mainstream archaeology has been comfortable accommodating, and yet the evidence for it is not speculative or ambiguous. It is measurable, it is repeatable. Any astronomer with the right software and the coordinates of a medicine wheel can verify the alignments in an afternoon. The question is not whether the alignments exist. They do. The question is what they mean, and that question leads into territory that makes institutional archaeology very uncomfortable, because what it means, if it is intentional, is that the people who built these structures were doing something that we have consistently assumed pre-contact North American cultures were not doing: maintaining a sophisticated, geographically distributed, multi-generational system for observing and recording the movements of the sky. That is the kind of thing we associate with Egypt, with Babylon, with the Maya, not with the Canadian plains 4,000 years before the first Europeans set foot on this continent. Let us go further east. Let us go to Ontario, to the Canadian Shield Country north of Lake Ontario, to a place that most visitors to Toronto have never heard of, and that most Canadians who have heard of it have been given only the most basic and least interesting version of the story. Let us go to Serpent Mounds Provincial Park on the north shore of Rice Lake, where a group of earthen structures, arranged along a low peninsula above the water, has been waiting for a satisfying explanation since European settlers first noticed it in the 1890s and tried to fit it into the categories they had available. The mounds at Rice Lake are not unique in the global catalogue of earthen construction. Mound-building cultures are documented across much of eastern North America, most famously in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, where the Adena and Hopewell traditions produced some of the most impressive pre-contact monuments on the continent. The connection of the Rice Lake mounds to those Ohio Valley traditions has been the standard explanation offered by Canadian archaeology. They are an expression of Hopewell influence, or Hopewell-related practice, spreading northward through the Great Lakes region during the period roughly between 2,000 and 1,500 years ago, when that cultural tradition was at its height. This explanation is not wrong, it may be partially right. There are aspects of the Rice Lake mounds that do correspond to Hopewell practice. The construction method, the presence of burial deposits within the mounds, the use of specific materials that have been traced to Hopewell exchange networks. These connections are real. But the explanation leaves out the most interesting part, and the part that most draws visitors to the site when they finally see it from above. The main mound at Rice Lake is not a simple oval burial mound or a platform mound or any of the other standard shapes in the Hopewell catalogue. It is a serpent. Not vaguely serpentine, not interpretable as a serpent in the way that a curved ridge of earth might be charitably described, but deliberately, precisely, unmistakably a serpent. The body undulates in a series of curves that any 3-year-old looking at the aerial photograph would immediately recognize as a snake. The head is defined, the tail tapers to a point. The entire structure is approximately 60 meters long, and it was built with enough care and intentionality that it has retained its shape for nearly 2,000 years of freeze-thaw cycles, root growth, and seasonal flooding. Now, the standard explanation handles this. The Hopewell or Hopewell-influenced people who built it were expressing a snake symbolism that was central to their cosmological and spiritual framework. Fair enough. Snake imagery is documented across Hopewell sites in Ohio. This is consistent. But here is what the standard explanation does not address. There is another serpent mound in North America, a famous one. In Ohio, at a site called Serpent Mound in Adams County, there is an earthwork nearly 400 meters long in the shape of an uncoiling serpent, and it has been one of the great mysteries of American archaeology since it was first documented in the 19th century. The two structures, the Ohio one and the Ontario one, are separated by hundreds of kilometers. They are connected by what the standard narrative describes as cultural diffusion, ideas traveling along trade networks from the Ohio heartland northward into Canada. But look at the alignments. Look at what the serpents are doing, structurally, in relation to the landscape and the sky. The Ohio Serpent Mound, when properly oriented by researchers who have studied it using modern astronomical tools, is aligned to the summer solstice sunset. The head and the oval at the end of the mound, which has been interpreted as either an egg or a sun symbol, points directly at the horizon position of the setting sun on the longest day of the year. This alignment was not an accident. It required planning, measurement, and a calendar system sophisticated enough to identify the solstice position with accuracy. The Rice Lake serpent in Ontario, while smaller and less dramatic, shows a similar orientation logic. The relationship of the body's curves to the surrounding landscape and the placement of the mound on the peninsula above the lake suggests a careful attention to the visual relationship between the structure and the sky that goes beyond simple burial practice. Something was being marked here, something about time, about the movements of the sun or the stars or both, was being encoded in the shape and placement of these earthen forms. And when you begin to ask what knowledge system was doing that encoding, and how that knowledge system was maintained across the vast distances between the Ohio Valley and the Canadian Shield, and how it produced structures in both places that demonstrate the same underlying astronomical literacy, you are asking a question that the standard framework of pre-contact North American history is not well equipped to answer. Move further east now. Go to the edge of the Shield country where it gives way to the river valleys of eastern Ontario and Quebec, to the great corridor of the Street. Lawrence, that enormous river system that was, for thousands of years, the main highway of eastern North America, the Street. Lawrence is where some of the most contentious and most suppressed archaeological evidence in Canadian history has emerged, and it is where the gap between what the ground has produced and what the official record acknowledges is perhaps widest and most difficult to explain away. In the 1820s, workers digging near the town of Hochelaga, which would later become Montreal, unearthed a series of stone chambers. Not the traces of stone chambers, not the foundations of stone chambers. Actual intact stone chambers, roofed and floored and walled, constructed with a competence and a formality that the workers who found them had no framework to explain. The chambers were not Native American in any style documented in the region. They were not French colonial, they were not English. They predated, by the evidence of the soil that had accumulated above them and the organic material found within them, any European presence in the area by a margin that the workers of the 1820s, who were not archaeologists, could not quantify, but that every subsequent person who has examined the records of the find has found troubling. The chambers were recorded, descriptions were written, a few artifacts found within them were preserved, and then, because the digging for which the ground was being opened continued, the chambers were destroyed. The foundation of whatever was being built was laid on top of where they had been, and the physical evidence disappeared. What remained were the records, and the records were quietly filed in provincial archives where they sat for decades without generating the investigation they deserved. This pattern, the discovery of anomalous structural evidence, the inadequate documentation, the physical destruction of the site, the archival burial of the records, is not unique to the Montreal Chambers. It appears across eastern Canada with a consistency that is itself suspicious, not because it necessarily reflects deliberate suppression, but because it reflects the operation of a cultural assumption so powerful that it shaped what people thought it was worth preserving. The assumption was that pre-contact North America did not contain architectural traditions capable of producing stone chambers of the kind described. Therefore, what the workers had found must have been something else, something that fit the categories available, even if the fit was poor. And when the something else explanation was not convincing, the site was destroyed before a better explanation could be sought. The Montreal Chambers are not the only example from the St. Lawrence region. At multiple points along the river, in the exposed limestone beds of the river's banks, and on the islands that punctuate the upper reaches of the waterway, there are features that have been noticed, documented, puzzled over, and inadequately explained since the first systematic surveys of the region in the 19th century. Stone alignments that run along the river's edge at angles that correspond to astronomical orientations. Depressions in the bedrock that show evidence of deliberate shaping and that are too regular to be natural potholes. And in at least one documented case from a site near the Ontario-Quebec border, a series of stone-lined shafts that descend into the bedrock itself, their walls smooth in ways that frost and water action alone cannot produce, their depths exceeding anything that simple quarrying or root cellar construction would require. Who made the shafts? What were they for? The honest answer is that no one who has examined them has been able to provide a definitive response. The Indigenous peoples of the region, the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe, have their own relationships to the landscape of the Centrator. Lawrence Valley, their own sacred sites and traditional territories, their own deep histories with this river. But when researchers have asked about the specific features being described, the response from traditional knowledge holders has sometimes been illuminating in an unexpected direction. Not recognition of these particular structures as part of their own tradition, but rather acknowledgement that there were things in this land before them, that the land carries evidence of presences older than their own memory of it. That kind of acknowledgement, from oral traditions that typically span thousands of years, is not nothing, it is a form of testimony. It is the same kind of testimony that we encountered in the plains, where Indigenous memory placed the medicine wheels outside its own historical horizon. When the people who have lived on a landscape for the longest documented time tell you that something on that landscape is older than their memory of it, the appropriate response is to take that seriously, rather than to look for a way to fit it into a framework that denies the possibility. Go north now. Go to the regions of Canada that most people, even most Canadians, have never visited and never will. The subarctic, the boreal transition zone, the vast territory between the southern edge of the shield and the tree line where the boreal gives way to tundra. This is perhaps the least known part of Canada archaeologically, and it is precisely here, in the territories that have been systematically underexplored and underinterpreted, that some of the most startling structural evidence has come to light in recent decades. The people who lived here, the ancestors of the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Dene, and a dozen other nations, were nomadic or semi-nomadic hunters and fishers whose relationship to the land was one of movement and seasonal adaptation. They did not, in the historical record and in the conventional archaeological framework, build permanent stone structures. They did not leave earthworks or stone monuments of the kind we have been describing. They left tent rings, fire-cracked rock, flaked stone tools, the evidence of camps occupied and abandoned and returned to in seasonal cycles. But in the territory between northern Manitoba and the Hudson Bay lowlands, researchers in the 1990s and 2000s began finding something that did not fit this description. Alignments of stones, running for hundreds of meters across open ground, too long and too straight for tent ring middens or campfire arrangements, too purposeful in their orientation to be explained by natural processes. Some of these alignments were arranged in parallel sets, 2 or 3 lines running side by side at consistent spacings. Some converged at what appeared to be focal points. Some were associated with cairns built to a height that exceeded any practical purpose for landmark or cache marking. When the first few of these were reported, the response from the archaeological establishment was the familiar one: natural formations, misidentified by observers unfamiliar with the range of shapes that glacial and periglacial processes can produce. This is always the first response, and it is not always wrong. The subarctic landscape is full of things that look deliberate and are not. Eskers, those long, sinuous ridges of glacially deposited material, can look from certain angles like deliberate earthworks. Frost polygons, the geometric patterns that form in permafrost as water freezes and thaws in the soil, can produce arrangements of stones and trenches that look astonishingly regular. The environment is full of apparent order that is actually chaos, and disentangling one from the other requires careful on-the-ground examination that is expensive and difficult in territory that is remote and seasonally inaccessible. But when the on-the-ground examinations were done, some of the Manitoba alignments survived the scrutiny. They were not eskers, they were not frost polygons. The stones were of a type not locally available, which meant they had been carried. The alignments showed evidence of deliberate clearing of natural vegetation from between them. And when the orientation of the alignments was plotted against astronomical data, some of them showed the same pattern that keeps appearing at pre-contact structures across Canada: a relationship to the rising and setting positions of specific stars on specific days, arranged as if the people who built them were using the landscape as a calendar. This is not what is supposed to be in the subarctic. Nomadic hunter-gatherers are not supposed to have built astronomical monuments. They are not supposed to have maintained the kind of multi-generational institutional knowledge required to design, construct, and calibrate a stone alignment that tracks stellar positions with measurable accuracy. They are not supposed to, because the framework that was assigned to pre-contact North American cultures did not make room for it. But the stones do not care what they are supposed to do. They sit on the ground and they point at the sky, and they wait for someone to ask the right question. The right question, which very few institutional researchers have been willing to ask publicly, is this: is there evidence of a pre-contact astronomical tradition in Canada that spans multiple regions, multiple cultural groups, multiple time periods, and that represents a systematic, sophisticated body of knowledge about the movements of the sky? The answer, based on the accumulated evidence from the medicine wheels, the serpent mounds, the Manitoba alignments, and the petroglyphs, is yes. There is such evidence, and its existence requires an explanation that the conventional framework of pre-contact North American history does not currently provide. Now let us go to the water, because some of the most extraordinary and least known structural evidence in Canada is not on the land but under it. Beneath the surface of the Great Lakes, which together contain more than 20% of the world's fresh surface water, there are features of the lake beds that have been generating quiet scientific astonishment since the first systematic sonar surveys in the mid-20th century. And in Lake Huron in particular, the second largest of the Great Lakes by surface area, there is a discovery that was made in the early 21st century that should be far better known than it is. In 2007, a team of researchers from the University of Michigan was using side-scan sonar equipment to map the bed of Lake Huron's Alpena Amberley Ridge, a broad submarine plateau that runs beneath the northern part of the lake. The ridge was known to be a submerged former land surface, a piece of terrain that had been above water during the last ice age when lake levels were much lower than they are today. This was not news. The basic fact of the Alpena Amberley Ridge had been understood for some time. What was not understood, what the 2007 sonar survey revealed for the first time in sharp enough resolution to be unmistakable, was that the submerged surface of the ridge contained structures. Stone alignments. A lane of stones running for nearly a kilometre in a straight line across the lake bed, flanked by what appeared to be V-shaped stone arrangements at intervals along its length. And at one end of the alignment, a series of stone circles arranged in configurations that the researchers who found them, careful and skeptical scientists who chose their words with deliberate caution, described as consistent with deliberate human construction. The Alpena Amberley Ridge has been below water for approximately 9,500 years. That is when the lake levels rose to their current approximate height at the end of the last ice age. The structures on the ridge, therefore, if they are human-made, were built no later than 9,500 years ago. possibly significantly earlier, possibly on a landscape that was above water for thousands of years before the lake rose to cover it. 9,500 years ago is not a figure that fits comfortably in the conventional narrative of pre-contact North American history. At that point in time, the entire North American continent is supposed to have been populated exclusively by small, mobile hunting groups in the early stages of the cultural traditions that would eventually produce the Archaic period, cultures documented in the archaeological record. These groups, the narrative holds, were not building stone monuments. They were not constructing kilometer-long alignments. They were not creating structured landscapes of the kind the sonar images appeared to show. The researchers who found the Alpina Ambili structures were aware of this tension. They were careful. They published their findings in peer-reviewed journals. They described their methodology. They presented the sonar images. And they proposed, tentatively, that the structures might be associated with caribou hunting, that the long linear alignment might be a drive lane used to channel caribou toward hunters waiting at specific points, and that the V-shaped features might be hunting blinds or funnel structures designed to direct the animals. This explanation is plausible. Drive lanes for hunting large prey animals are documented in prehistoric contexts on other submerged landscapes around the world. The existence of a drive lane at Alpina Ambili would be remarkable in terms of its preservation and its age, but would not necessarily require any revision of the conventional framework. It would simply be evidence of sophisticated cooperative hunting by Archaic period cultures, which is itself not controversial. But the drive lane explanation does not fully account for all the features observed. The stone circles, in particular, do not have an obvious hunting function. Stone circles of the kind observed on the ridge are associated, in the contexts where they appear elsewhere, with habitation sites and ceremonial sites, not with hunting infrastructure. Their presence at Alpina Ambili suggests that whatever was happening on this submerged ridge 9,000 or more years ago, it included not just hunting activity, but some form of more permanent, or at least more structured occupation of the landscape. And there is more to the underwater story. Because Lake Huron is not the only Great Lake with anomalous underwater features. Lake Ontario, the smallest and most southerly of the Great Lakes, has produced a series of sonar anomalies in its deeper sections that have been documented and then quietly set aside without the investigation they appear to warrant. Some of these anomalies are almost certainly natural. Bedrock formations, glacial erratics resting on the lake floor, the kind of visual confusion that sonar imaging can produce in complex underwater terrain. But some of them show the regularity and the geometric precision that distinguishes deliberate construction from natural processes, and the failure to investigate them thoroughly is an absence in the scientific record that is difficult to justify on purely methodological grounds. The underwater evidence, taken together with the land-based evidence from the prairies and the Shield and the St. Lawrence Valley, is beginning to form a picture. Not a complete picture. Not a picture that resolves into a single, coherent, nameable civilization, but a picture of a pre-contact North America that was significantly more complex, more architecturally active, and more astronomically sophisticated than the conventional narrative allows. A picture of a continent where people were building things, marking things, encoding knowledge in the landscape across a time span and a geographic range that exceeds anything in the standard account. And then there is Nova Scotia. And then there is what people in certain quarters have spent a century and a half calling, variously, the Oak Island Money Pit, the Oak Island Mystery, and the Oak Island Curse. And before you dismiss that as the territory of treasure hunters and television documentaries, which it has certainly become, let's take a step back to what was actually found there and why it is genuinely, archaeologically, structurally strange. Oak Island is a small island in Mahone Bay on the south shore of Nova Scotia. It is about 57 hectares in size, wooded, unremarkable to the eye, the kind of island that a sailor passing through Mahone Bay in a small boat might glance at without stopping. In 1795, a teenager named Daniel McGuinness noticed a circular depression in the ground on the island's surface, a depression that had a certain deliberateness to it, a regularity inconsistent with natural settling. He recruited two friends, John Smith and Anthony Vaughan, and they began to dig. They found, at various depths as they descended into the shaft, evidence of human activity, layers of flagstones, layers of oak logs. Platforms of timber spaced at regular intervals in a way that was clearly structural rather than natural. The shaft itself was circular and about 3 meters in diameter and showed every sign of having been dug deliberately and then filled back in, with the log platforms placed as the refilling occurred to create what appeared to be a deliberate trap. This is the beginning of the Oak Island story that has consumed treasure hunters for 2.25 centuries, and the mythology that has accumulated around it involves everything from pirate treasure to Freemason vaults to the Ark of the Covenant to documents that prove the true authorship of Shakespeare's plays. All of that belongs to a different category of storytelling than what we are doing here. What is actually interesting about Oak Island, from the perspective of the question we are exploring, is not what might be at the bottom of the shaft. It is the engineering of the shaft itself and of the systems apparently associated with it. Because as investigation of the island continued over the subsequent decades, something emerged that was more interesting than any treasure: evidence of a drainage system. A deliberate, engineered, technically sophisticated drainage system that connected the shaft to the sea through a network of underground tunnels in such a way that any serious attempt to pump out the water that flooded the shaft would be defeated by the inflow from the ocean. This is not the work of amateurs. A drainage system of the kind apparently present on Oak Island, if it was built deliberately, required an understanding of hydraulic engineering, of the relationship between tidal cycles and groundwater pressure, and of the subsurface geology of the island, that represents a significant body of knowledge and expertise. The builders, whoever they were, knew what they were doing. They knew how to prevent the shaft from being easily excavated by anyone who lacked an understanding of the system they had built. Who had that knowledge? The treasure hunting tradition says pirates, most often the privateer Captain Kidd. The revisionist tradition says Knights Templar or Francis Bacon, or any number of other candidates from the categories of European history that appeal to different audiences. But here is what neither tradition fully addresses. The dating evidence from the shaft and its associated features does not straightforwardly support any post-Columbian construction date. The wood samples that have been retrieved from the deeper levels of the shaft, from below the depths that any historical account of construction activity on the island could plausibly account for, have produced radiocarbon dates that place them between 300 and 500 years old, which is consistent with post-Columbian construction. But there are also anomalous dates from different parts of the site that suggest activity that is considerably older, and the stone features at the edges of the island, the stone formations in the coastal zone, and the intertidal areas that appear to be part of the larger system associated with the shaft, show evidence of construction that predates any European presence on the island. If the Oak Island structure has a pre-contact component, and the physical evidence at least raises that possibility, then what we are looking at is not a pirate treasure vault or a Templar repository, but something more interesting. Evidence of pre-contact engineering on the Atlantic coast of Canada, in the same general zone where other anomalous evidence has emerged, that represents a level of technical sophistication inconsistent with the conventional picture of pre-contact North America. Now, the Peterborough petroglyphs, because if any single site in Canada encapsulates the problem we have been exploring, the gap between what the physical evidence shows and what the official record is willing to say about it, it is the site about 90 kilometres northeast of Peterborough, Ontario, that the Ontario Heritage Foundation manages and that the local Anishinaabe people call Kinumaage Wapkong, which means, roughly, the rocks that teach. The Peterborough petroglyph site contains approximately 900 carved images on a sloping surface of white crystalline marble. Carved by hand using stone tools, the images include animals, humans, abstract forms, and most controversially, forms that some researchers have identified as boats, specifically boats of a non-North American type, boats with masts and prows that look nothing like the canoes and watercraft of the Anishinaabe tradition, but that bear a remarkable resemblance to the ships of Bronze Age Scandinavia. The conventional explanation for the Peterborough petroglyphs is that they were created by Algonquian-speaking peoples over a period extending from approximately 900 to 1500 years ago, that they represent a religious or ceremonial site of significance to the local Indigenous traditions, and that the images are expressions of Algonquian cosmology and spiritual practice. This explanation is supported by the cultural testimony of the Anishinaabe people themselves, who maintain a living connection to the site and it is probably correct in substantial part, but it does not explain the boats. Or rather, the mainstream explanation explains the boats by saying that they are not boats. That what some researchers have identified as sailed watercraft are in fact representations of a curved shamanic spirit object, a supernatural canoe, a cosmological figure that appears in Algonquian tradition. This explanation is plausible. It is possible, but it requires a certain determination to find an alternative reading for images that, to a significant number of careful observers, look very much like sailed vessels. Barry Fell, the Harvard marine biologist and epigrapher who spent decades claiming to identify Old World scripts in North American rock art, argued that the Peterborough site contained not just ship images, but actual writing, Ogham script, the ancient Irish writing system, and Tifinagh, the script of the Berber peoples of North Africa. Fell's work has been largely dismissed by mainstream academics, and much of his decipherment work is genuinely problematic from a methodological standpoint. He saw scripts in marks that other researchers read as natural weathering or simple decorative patterns, and his translations were sometimes strained to the point of implausibility. But here is the frustrating thing about the Peterborough petroglyphs debate. The dismissal of Fell's specific decipherments has been used to dismiss the broader question he was raising, which was whether the site contained evidence of pre-contact contact between North America and Old World cultures. The dismissal of the translator has been taken as dismissal of the translation problem itself, and the two things are not the same. You can reject Fell's readings of specific marks while still asking why certain images at Peterborough look like things they have no obvious local precedent for. The ship images remain, whatever they represent, and the debate about their interpretation continues among researchers who are more careful and less sensational than Fell. They are there. They are carved into the same rock face as the clearly Algonquian cosmological images. They were made by the same kinds of tools, and they raise a question that has not received a satisfying answer in the 40-plus years since the site was formally protected and studied. Where did the image of a sailed vessel come from in a cultural tradition that had no sailed vessels? Go further east now. Go to the edge of the continent, to Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, the Atlantic provinces that jut out into the North Atlantic on the far eastern edge of Canada. This is the part of the country where the transatlantic contact question is at its sharpest, because we know for a documented and archaeologically verified fact that Norse explorers from Greenland established a settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in northern Newfoundland around the year 1000 CE. This is not disputed. The excavation of L'Anse aux Meadows in the 1960s by Helga and Anstein Ingstad produced physical evidence, structures, artifacts, and carbon-dated organic material that established beyond reasonable doubt that Europeans were in North America 500 years before Columbus. L'Anse aux Meadows is the known contact, but researchers who have spent time in the Atlantic provinces, particularly in the coastal zones of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, have found evidence that raises the question of whether the Norse contact at 1000 CE was the beginning of something or the continuation of something. Because in certain coastal areas, in places that would have been natural landing points for anyone crossing the North Atlantic in a vessel that needed to follow the prevailing winds and currents, there are stone structures of a type that does not fit any indigenous North American architectural tradition, but that does correspond to construction practices documented in Iron Age and Bronze Age Northern Europe. Stone chambers, again, roofed with capstones in the corbelling technique used in megalithic construction across the Atlantic coast of Europe, from Spain to Ireland to Scandinavia. Some of these chambers are known and interpreted as root cellars, as the storage structures that early European settlers built to keep their vegetables through the winter. This interpretation is almost certainly correct for many of them. Root cellars are a well-documented phenomenon in Atlantic Canada, and they used stone construction techniques that superficially resemble the chambers in question. But some of the chambers are in locations that make the root cellar explanation difficult. They are not near any documented colonial settlement. They are not near any agricultural land that would have produced vegetables worth storing. They are in positions that would have been visible from the sea, on headlands and prominences above the coastline, in spots that a mariner would have used as landmarks. And their construction quality the care of the stonework, the precision of the corbelling, the orientation of the entrance, is in some cases better than the root cellars of the colonial period, not worse. These chambers have been noticed and reported in scattered local publications since the 19th century. A researcher named Gloria Farley documented dozens of them across the Atlantic provinces in the middle of the 20th century. A group of amateur researchers connected to the New England Antiquities Research Association, or NERA, has maintained a database of similar structures across both Atlantic Canada and New England for decades. None of this documentation has produced the sustained professional archaeological investigation it deserves, in part because the structures, once filed under possible root cellar, tend to stay there in the literature, and in part because the question they most urgently raise, the question of whether pre-Norse Old World contact with North America left structural evidence that is physically present in the landscape, is one that institutional archaeology has generally preferred not to examine. The reluctance is understandable. The history of pre-Columbian contact claims is littered with cases where wishful thinking and cultural bias produced readings of ambiguous evidence that said more about the reader than the rock. Welsh colonists, Phoenician traders, Egyptian explorers, Hebrew migrations. The claim space of pre-Columbian contact theory has been thoroughly populated by people who wanted very much to find something specific, and who found it in the ambiguous marks and shapes of an ancient and complex landscape. The embarrassment of those false positives has made serious researchers cautious about the entire category of question, to the point where genuine anomalies have been left unexamined because their investigation might be associated with the fringe. This is a real problem. It is not a conspiracy. It is not deliberate suppression. It is the ordinary operation of a scholarly community trying to protect its credibility by maintaining distance from questions that have been contaminated by bad actors. The cost of that protection is that legitimate anomalies go unexamined. And the anomalies we have been describing tonight, taken together, constitute a body of evidence that is too large and too varied and too well documented to be explained by the contamination of the adjacent fringe. Let us take stock of what we have covered so far. We have the astronomical alignments of the prairie medicine wheels, some of which date to 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, calibrated to stellar positions with a precision that requires sophisticated knowledge. We have the serpent mounds of Ontario, oriented to solstice events in the same manner as their Ohio counterparts, separated by hundreds of kilometers, but sharing an underlying astronomical logic. We have the stone chambers and shafts of the Street Lawrence Valley, anomalous in their construction and their dating, inadequately documented before their physical destruction. We have the underwater structures of Lake Huron, dated to 9,500 years before present, showing evidence of organized construction on a now submerged landscape. We have the engineering complexity of Oak Island, which may or may not have a pre-contact component, but which represents a level of technical sophistication that demands explanation. We have the Peterborough petroglyphs, with their unexplained ship images. We have the atmospheric alignments of the BC petroglyphs. We have the stone chambers of Atlantic Canada. Each of these, taken alone, might be accommodated within the conventional framework by stretching the available explanations. But taken together, across a country as large as Canada, spanning a time frame from 9,000 years ago to perhaps 2,000 years ago, they form a pattern that is harder to dismiss. They suggest, without proving, that the pre-contact history of Canada is significantly more complex than what is taught in schools or acknowledged in the standard literature. They suggest the possibility of knowledge systems, architectural traditions, astronomical practices, and perhaps contact with Old World cultures that predate by centuries or millennia the events that the official history treats as firsts. And they raise a question that is perhaps the most important one we can ask. A question that should motivate investigation rather than defensiveness. What did we miss and why? The answer to what did we miss is complex and still being assembled. But part of the answer to why is simpler and more uncomfortable. We missed it because the history of North America was written by people who arrived after the fact, who brought with them a framework of cultural assumptions that did not make room for complexity in the pre-contact past, and who, in many cases, had direct institutional and economic interests in minimizing the sophistication of the cultures that had been displaced to make room for the new order. This is not ancient history. The residential school system in Canada, which forcibly separated Indigenous children from their families and their languages and their knowledge systems, did not end until 1996. The systematic undermining of Indigenous cultural knowledge, including knowledge that might have illuminated the very mysteries we have been discussing, is a recent event, not a distant one. Some of the elders who carry oral traditions that connect directly to the ancient structures we have been describing grew up in residential schools where those traditions were suppressed. This is part of the story too. The gap in our understanding of pre-contact Canada is not only an academic gap. It is a gap that was partly created by policies of cultural erasure, and closing it requires not only better archaeology but better listening, a willingness to hear what the people who have been on this land the longest have to say about it, even when what they say does not fit the categories that Western scholarship has provided. Let us go back to the ground. Let us go to a specific kind of structure that appears across Canada, one that has been noticed by many people in many places over many years, but that has never received the sustained collective attention it deserves. Let us talk about the cairns. A cairn is, in its simplest definition, a pile of stones. Cairns are made for many purposes by many cultures: to mark a trail, to mark a grave, to mark a sacred spot, to mark a territorial boundary. They are common across the world and common across time. The cairns of northern Canada, the Inuit Inuksuk and its regional variants, are among the most recognizable symbols of Canadian identity. So when someone reports finding a cairn in the Canadian landscape, the response is understandably measured. A cairn is a cairn. But there are cairns in Canada that are not quite cairns in the ordinary sense. There are stone accumulations in certain specific locations across the country that are structured in ways that exceed the practical requirements of any of the ordinary cairn functions. Cairns that are larger than they need to be for a marker. Cairns that are placed at positions that correspond to astronomical sightlines rather than trail junctions or territorial margins. Cairns that are built from stones that were carried from locations far from where they now sit, requiring effort that a simple waymarker would not justify. And cairns that are arranged in spatial relationships to each other, that suggest they are not individual markers but components of a larger system. Some of the most interesting examples of this kind of cairn complex are found in Labrador, in the territory that the Innu people have occupied for thousands of years. The Labrador interior is among the least archaeologically surveyed territories in North America. Remote, seasonally inaccessible, covered in boreal forest and muskeg, traversed by river systems that are the primary transportation corridors, but that have received only sporadic investigation. What little systematic survey has been done has focused on the coastal zones and on the major river valleys, leaving enormous areas of the interior essentially unknown from an archaeological standpoint. In the areas that have been examined, the picture that emerges is of a landscape that was used far more intensively and with far more long-term structure than the nomadic hunter model of the subarctic would predict. There are habitation sites on elevated terrain, on hilltops and ridgetops that offer wide views of the surrounding country that show evidence of repeated occupation over very long periods. Some of these sites include stone features, alignments and platforms, and the unusual cairns described above, that are associated with the repeated occupation of the high ground in ways that suggest not just camping, but something more: observation, ceremony, the marking of a relationship between the human community and the landscape that goes beyond simple subsistence. The Innu oral tradition speaks of Labrador as a land full of power, full of entities and forces that the human community must maintain careful relations with. The high places in particular are places of significance, places where the boundary between the human and the more than human world is thin. This is, in the language of Indigenous spiritual tradition, a description of what anthropologists call sacred geography, the practice of identifying and marking places in the landscape that are understood as having special cosmological significance. Sacred geography is not a pre-contact North American invention. It is a human universal. Every culture for which we have sufficient records has maintained some version of it. What is notable about the evidence from Labrador and from other parts of the Canadian subarctic where similar patterns have been observed is that the physical markers of sacred geography, the cairns and alignments and platform structures, appear to be significantly older than any cultural tradition currently active in the area. They are acknowledged by current inhabitants as ancient, as belonging to a time before the present order, as connected to powers and presences that preceded the current occupants of the land. That kind of acknowledgement, combined with the physical evidence of the structures themselves, creates a genuine puzzle. Not a puzzle that requires exotic solutions. Not a puzzle that demands extraterrestrial intervention or the importing of old-world civilizations into the Canadian subarctic, but a puzzle that requires taking seriously the possibility that the pre-contact history of this land is longer, more layered, and more architecturally active than the conventional timeline allows. Let us turn now to a region that many people would not immediately think of in connection with ancient mysteries: the interior of British Columbia, specifically the Okanagan Valley and the neighboring Highland Plateaus. The Okanagan is associated in most people's minds with wine and fruit and a mild climate that is anomalous in a country otherwise defined by cold. What it is less commonly associated with is what lies beneath it. The Okanagan Valley sits in a geological context that is, by any measure, unusual. It is a lake-filled trench carved by ice and tectonic activity, surrounded by basalt plateaus that are among the oldest exposed geological formations in Western Canada. The lakes of the Okanagan system, including Okanagan Lake itself, are long and deep and cold, occupying valley floors that were scoured to great depth by the ice of the last glaciation. And at the bottom of some of those lakes, beneath hundreds of meters of cold, clear water, there are features that have been noticed on sonar surveys, but that have received only the most cursory investigation. The most interesting of these is a series of what appears to be a stone alignment on the floor of Okanagan Lake, first noticed in a sonar survey conducted in the late 1990s in connection with environmental monitoring of the lake. The alignment, which runs for approximately 200 meters in a roughly east-west direction across a relatively flat area of the lakebed at a depth of about 40 meters, consists of a series of upright stones standing in a configuration that the survey operators noted but did not pursue further, filing a report that mentioned unusual bottom features and moving on to the environmental data they had been commissioned to collect. The 40-meter depth of the alignment is interesting. 40 meters below the current lake level is within the range of lake levels that existed during the period between the end of the last ice age and the establishment of the lake at its current approximate depth, which occurred roughly 8 to 10,000 years ago. If the stones were placed when the lake floor was above water, they are at least 8,000 years old, possibly considerably older. What were they? Without proper investigation, the honest answer is that we do not know. But the configuration described in the sonar data, upright stones arranged in a line, is not a natural geological formation. Stones do not arrange themselves in lines on lake floors without human assistance. The question of who was on the floor of the Okanagan Valley 8,000 or more years ago, doing something that involved arranging upright stones, is one that has not been asked by any institution with the resources to answer it. This is the central frustration of Canadian prehistory. Not that the questions are unanswerable, but that they are not being asked. The resources, the technology, the methodological tools, the collaborative frameworks between academic institutions and Indigenous knowledge holders, all of these exist. The missing ingredient, in most cases, is not capability but will. The will to take seriously a set of questions that challenge a comfortable narrative. The will to invest in investigation of anomalies that might, if properly understood, require significant revision of what we think we know. The will to let the evidence lead, rather than to lead the evidence. In the meantime, the structures sit. They wait in the forest. They lie on the lake floors. They project their alignments at the stars. They endure in the deep cold of permafrost and the deep dark of cave chambers. Some of them are being damaged by development, by logging, by the ordinary activity of a country that does not fully know what it is sitting on. Others are being slowly uncovered by erosion, by the retreat of ice, by the same forces that have been reshaping the Canadian landscape since the glaciers retreated and the land began the long process of reasserting itself. And a few of them are being studied, carefully and responsibly, by researchers who understand that the history of this land is older and more complex than the textbooks say, and who are doing the patient work of documentation and analysis that may, eventually, produce a more accurate picture. There is a place in the boreal forest of northern Saskatchewan, about 300 kilometers northeast of Saskatoon, that most people in the world have never heard of, and that even most people in Saskatchewan do not know exists. It is called Waskesiu after the lake at the center of Prince Albert National Park, and in the park's interior, beyond the reach of the trails that most visitors use, there is a series of stone structures that a park employee stumbled on in the early 2000s while doing maintenance work on a backcountry route. The structures are not dramatic. They are not the kind of thing that would appear on the cover of National Geographic. They are low ridges of stone, barely a meter high at their most elevated point, running in curves and angles across a clearing that the boreal forest has been slowly reclaiming for some time, but that, in the aerial photography taken when the park was first established, appears as a more open space. The ridges form patterns that are only comprehensible from above, patterns that the park employee, looking at an aerial photograph after his ground-level discovery, recognized as geometric, not the random geometry of nature, but the intended geometry of something planned and executed by a thinking mind. The park authority, to its credit, took the find seriously enough to commission a preliminary assessment. The assessment, conducted by a provincial archaeologist, confirmed that the features were not natural, but declined to make any determination about their cultural affiliation or age, recommending further investigation that has not, as far as public records show, been funded or carried out. The features remain in the park's files as anomalous stone features, origin undetermined, and the clearing slowly fills with spruce. This is not an unusual outcome. It is, in fact, the typical outcome for this kind of discovery in Canada. The find is made, the preliminary assessment confirms anomalousness, the recommendation for further investigation is made, the investigation is not funded, the site is not protected, and the window for understanding what was there gradually closes. Sometimes it closes because of natural processes, sometimes it closes because of development, sometimes it simply closes because everyone involved moves on to something else, and the institutional memory of the find disperses. The result, across Canada, is an enormous collection of partially documented, underfunded, underpursued anomalies. Each one, in isolation, is interesting but not conclusive. Together, they form something that demands a better response than the one they have received. They form the outline of a Canada that was, before any history was written, the site of significant human activity, architectural practice, astronomical observation, and possibly cultural exchange, across a time frame and a geographic range that exceeds anything the conventional narrative accounts for. And this brings us to the question that the title of this video raises, and that we have been circling around since the beginning. The historians who can't explain these structures. The conventional picture of pre-contact North America holds that complex, organized, architecturally significant cultures were confined to specific regions: the Ohio Valley, the Mississippi Valley, the Southwest, Mesoamerica, the Andean coast. Canada, in this picture, is a vast peripheral zone, occupied, but not architecturally engaged, inhabited by cultures whose relationship to the landscape was one of movement and adaptation rather than construction and marking. The histories that have been written about this country's deep past reflect that assumption, and they have been written so consistently and for so long that they have come to feel like established fact rather than inherited assumption. But they are an assumption, and the structures we have been discussing tonight are the physical evidence that the assumption is wrong, or at least incomplete. They do not, taken together, establish any single alternative narrative. They do not prove the existence of a specific lost civilization, or a specific transatlantic or trans-Pacific contact event, or any of the more dramatic claims that have been made in popular culture about the ancient history of North America. What they establish is more modest and more important. They establish that the conventional narrative leaves out a great deal, and that the great deal it leaves out includes evidence of human activity in Canada that is more sophisticated, more organized, and more temporally deep than the textbooks say. The historians who cannot explain these structures cannot explain them because the framework within which they work does not have room for what the structures imply. This is not a failure of intelligence or integrity, it is a failure of framework, and the history of science is full of cases where the framework was the problem, where anomalies accumulated for decades without resolution because the available conceptual tools were not adequate to the task, and where the eventual resolution required not just new data, but a new way of thinking about what the data meant. Canada is waiting for that new way of thinking, The structures are waiting. The lake floors are waiting. The cairns on the subarctic hilltops are waiting. The carved images on the white marble at Peterborough are waiting. The alignments on the prairie grass are waiting under the snow. And the questions they raise, about who was here, and for how long, and what they knew, and what they built, and why, are questions that this country's history deserves to answer. Not because the answers will be comfortable. They may not be. Not because the answers will resolve into a clean narrative. They probably will not. But because the truth of what happened on this land, over all the thousands of years before anyone thought to write it down, matters. It matters to the descendants of the people who were here. It matters to the understanding of human history globally, which has too long been told as if North America were a late arrival to the story of human complexity. And it matters because the structures themselves, the stones and the earthworks and the alignments and the chambers, have been waiting long enough. Let us go back to the lake floors one more time, because the most recent chapter in this story is unfolding underwater, and it involves not the Great Lakes but a much smaller and less studied body of water in northern Ontario. A lake whose name in the Indigenous language of the people who have lived on its shores for generations translates as something like the place where the water speaks. Researchers at a university in northern Ontario, working in partnership with local Anishinaabe communities whose oral traditions speak of specific significant places along this lake's shores, began a sonar mapping project in the early 2020s that has produced results currently being written up for publication. The results, which have been shared in preliminary form at a regional conference on Indigenous archaeology, include the identification of what appears to be a series of stone circles on the lake bed at a depth consistent with lake levels from between 6,000 and 8,000 years ago. The circles, which range from approximately 3 to 12 meters in diameter, are arranged in a spatial pattern that does not correspond to any natural geological process the geologists on the team can identify. They are, the researchers believe, human-made. They are, if their dating estimate is correct, among the oldest structural features ever identified in Ontario. The research team has been careful to work within a framework that respects the Anishinaabe community's relationship to the lake and to the potential significance of these features. The community has shared oral traditions that speak of a time when the lake was smaller and the shores were farther out, when people built things on the ground where the water now is. These traditions, which had previously been interpreted as mythological or metaphorical, may be literal memory of a real landscape that existed thousands of years ago, preserved in oral form across the very long span of time during which the lake rose to cover the places being remembered. This is one of the most extraordinary aspects of this entire field of inquiry, the possibility that Indigenous oral traditions, which mainstream scholarship has consistently treated as a category of evidence too mythological and too temporally vague to be useful for understanding events thousands of years in the past, are in fact doing exactly what oral traditions in Australia have been shown to do, preserving accurate geographical and historical information across spans of time that exceed any written historical record. Australian Aboriginal oral traditions have been demonstrated to preserve accurate accounts of coastal flooding events that occurred between 7,000 and 14,000 years ago, verified by geological evidence. The traditions describe, in story form, the submergence of land that is now beneath the sea, and the geological record confirms that the submergence occurred at approximately the dates the traditions imply. This is not mythology. This is history transmitted orally across a period that dwarfs the entire span of written human history. If Aboriginal Australian oral traditions can preserve accurate geographical memory across 10,000 or more years, there is no principled reason to assume that Anishinaabe, or Cree, or Inuit, or any other Indigenous oral tradition cannot do the same. The systematic dismissal of Indigenous oral history as a form of evidence is not a methodologically defensible position. It is a cultural bias masquerading as methodology, and when that bias is removed, and Indigenous oral traditions are taken seriously as a form of historical evidence, some of the mysteries we have been discussing begin to look somewhat less mysterious, because the people who have been on this land the longest have, in many cases, been telling us what is there all along. This brings us to what may be the most important shift happening right now in the archaeology of pre-contact Canada, the growing practice of collaborative research that brings academic archaeologists and Indigenous knowledge holders into genuine partnership not the extractive relationships of the past where indigenous communities were sources of information that researchers used to write papers and build careers, but genuine collaborations where indigenous priorities, indigenous interpretive frameworks, and indigenous rights over their own history shape the research agenda. The results of this kind of collaboration are beginning to appear in the literature, and they are changing the picture in ways that matter. Sites that had been incompletely understood under the conventional framework are being reinterpreted in light of oral traditions that provide context the physical evidence alone could not supply. Dating and interpretation of features are being revised when indigenous knowledge holders identify them as belonging to traditions or periods different from what had been assumed. And in some cases, indigenous guidance is leading researchers to sites and features that had been completely missed by conventional survey methods because the conventional surveys did not know what to look for or where to look. The collaborative model is not a panacea. It does not automatically resolve every question, and it creates its own methodological challenges, including the challenge of working across different epistemological frameworks in ways that are respectful and intellectually honest for everyone involved. But it represents a more complete approach to understanding the deep past of this land than anything that came before, and some of the most significant discoveries in Canadian prehistory over the next generation will almost certainly come from this kind of work. Meanwhile, the structures wait, and there is one more category of evidence we have not yet discussed, one that is perhaps the most controversial and the most difficult to evaluate, but that recurs too often and too consistently in the landscape of pre-contact Canada to be entirely set aside. The category of what might be called anomalous metallurgy, evidence of copper working, specifically in contexts and at dates that do not fit the conventional picture of pre-contact North American technology. The copper is real. That is not in dispute. The Great Lakes region, particularly the area around Lake Superior and the Keweenaw Peninsula of what is now Michigan, is one of the richest copper deposits in the world, and there is abundant evidence that the copper was extracted and worked in pre-contact times. The Old Copper Complex, a cultural tradition associated with copper artifact production in the western Great Lakes region, has been dated to between 6,000 and 8,000 years ago, making it one of the oldest copper working traditions in the world. What is less well known, and what generates more controversy, is the scale of the copper extraction that took place over those millennia. Estimates based on survey work at the major mining sites suggest that somewhere between 1 and 1.5 billion pounds of copper were extracted from the Lake Superior region in pre-contact times. That is an enormous quantity of metal, and the question of where it went, what it was made into, and where the finished products ended up is one that the conventional archaeological record has only partially answered. The Old Copper Complex artifacts documented in North American sites account for some fraction of the extracted copper, but not all of it. By some estimates, the artifacts found represent only a small percentage of the total quantity of metal that the extraction evidence suggests was removed from the mines. The rest is unaccounted for. It went somewhere, and the question of where it went, whether it stayed in North America in forms that have not yet been found, or whether some portion of it left North America entirely, possibly via trade routes that extended further than the conventional map of pre-contact exchange allows, is one of the live and genuinely unresolved questions in the field. The scale of the copper extraction also raises questions about the social organization required to carry it out. Extracting 1 billion pounds of copper with stone and bone tools over a period of thousands of years is not the work of small nomadic bands pursuing copper as one resource among many. It is the work of organized, sustained, probably specialist labor, coordinated over multiple generations, with supply chains for tools and food to support the workers, and distribution networks for the finished product. It implies a level of social and economic complexity in the pre-contact Great Lakes region that the conventional framework does not assign to it. The copper miners were doing something sophisticated. They were doing it for a very long time, and the evidence of their work, the pits and trenches and spoil heaps of the Lake Superior mines, preserved in the landscape to this day, is one of the most dramatic pieces of evidence for pre-contact complexity in the entire country. It is also one of the least taught and least discussed, because it sits awkwardly in a narrative about pre-contact North America that does not have a good place for billion-pound copper industries operating 6,000 years ago. We are running out of things to say, in the sense that we are running out of individual pieces of evidence to describe. But we are not running out of the mystery itself. The mystery is, if anything, larger than when we started. Because what we have found, in moving across this enormous country from the petroglyphs of British Columbia to the copper mines of the Lake Superior region, from the medicine wheels of the prairies to the stone chambers of the Street Lawrence, from the underwater structures of Lake Huron to the suspicious alignments of the subarctic, is not one mystery but many, and the many mysteries are connected by a thread that keeps appearing in different forms in different places across the same land. The thread is this: the pre-contact history of Canada is not what we think it is. Not because a secret civilization built everything and left. Not because extraterrestrials intervened. Not because any of the dramatic alternative narratives of popular culture are correct, but because the people who lived here, for thousands and tens of thousands of years before any history was written down, were doing things that are more sophisticated, more organized, more astronomically aware, more architecturally ambitious, and more culturally complex than the conventional narrative allows. They were leaving marks in the landscape that we are only beginning to read. They were encoding knowledge in stone and earth and water that we are only beginning to understand how to decode. And they were connected to each other, and possibly to the wider world, in ways that challenge the picture of pre-contact North America as a collection of isolated, culturally simple, technologically modest societies waiting for the arrival of complexity from elsewhere. The complexity was here. It has always been here. It is written in the rocks and in the lake beds and in the alignments of stones on hilltops in the boreal forest. It is preserved in the oral traditions of people who have been telling the story all along, in a language that the institutions of Western scholarship are only now beginning to learn to hear. And it is waiting, with the patience of very old things, for the investigation it has deserved since the first curious person knelt in the forest and pressed a hand against the cold earth of a ridge that ran too straight to be an accident of nature. There will be more discoveries. The technology exists. The collaborative frameworks are developing. The willingness to ask the uncomfortable questions is growing. In the next decade, and the decade after that, and the decades that follow, the picture of pre-contact Canada will change. It will become more complex, more layered, more respectful of the depth and sophistication of the human history that unfolded here before any European arrived to write it down. And some of the questions we have raised tonight, questions that currently have no satisfying answer, will find answers that are stranger and more wonderful than anything the conventional narrative could have predicted. Until then, the structures wait. The lake floors hold their secrets. The forest grows slowly over the cleared spaces, where stone alignments mark directions we have not yet learned to read. The cairns on the subarctic hilltops stand against the wind, pointing at horizons that still mean something, even if we have temporarily forgotten what. And the stars above them, the same stars that the people who built all of these things watched and measured and recorded in stone and earth, continue their circuits overhead, patient and precise, and entirely indifferent to whether we understand them. We are a very young country, in the sense that the history we acknowledge is very young. We are a very old country, in the sense that the land beneath us has been shaped by human hands and human intentions for a length of time that should change everything we think we know about who we are and where we come from. The gap between those two truths is the space in which tonight's story has lived. And somewhere in that gap, in the cold ground under a northern forest, in the deep water of a lake that has been there since the glaciers retreated, in the precise alignments of stones on a prairie hilltop that has been swept by wind for 4,000 years, the real history of this land is waiting, not for someone to invent it, for someone to find it. It has been there all along. As you listen to this, wherever you are, whatever light is outside your window or whatever darkness, you are resting on or near a continent whose human history is longer and deeper and stranger than almost anyone has told you. The country that exists on paper, with its constitutions and its provinces, and its 2 official languages, and its hockey and its politeness, is a very recent overlay on something much older, something that built things we are only beginning to find, something that knew things about the sky that we are only beginning to understand, something that left marks in the landscape that are still speaking, in a language we are only beginning to learn to hear. Sleep well. The ground beneath you is very old, and it has been keeping its secrets patiently, waiting for exactly the right moment to begin telling them. That moment is coming. Maybe it has already begun. If tonight's journey into the hidden depths of this ancient land gave you something to carry into your dreams, into the quiet space where the mind loosens and lets old things in, then gently tap like if you feel moved to, so the algorithm knows to show this to others who might be lying awake at 2 a.m. wondering what is really under the ground they walk on every day. Subscribe if you want to keep following these threads into the dark. I would love to know where in the world you are listening from, what landscape is outside your window or beyond your walls, what time the clock says in your particular corner of this very old planet. Leave a comment if the words come. And if you want to support this work in a deeper way, there is a membership option here on YouTube, entirely optional, no pressure at all, just a way to help these long, slow journeys into forgotten history keep happening. For now, you do not need to do anything. The structures will still be there in the morning. The lake floors will still hold what they hold. The cairns will still be pointing at whatever they have been pointing at for 4,000 years. Rest now. Let the images settle. The forest, the cold ground, the alignments in the prairie grass, the carved serpent above the water, the stones on the lake floor, very still, very deep, very patient. You are part of a lineage that has been on this continent for a very long time, longer than the history books say. The people who built what we have been discussing tonight were doing so on land that has been shaped by human intention for 10,000 years or more. And the fact that we are only beginning to understand what they built is not a failure, it is an invitation. An invitation to look more carefully, to listen more patiently, to let the land speak in its own time and in its own language, which is older than any we have given it. Good night. The mysteries will be waiting when you wake up. They have been waiting a very long time already. A little longer will not trouble them at all. There is something about the way the Canadian landscape holds silence that feels different from anywhere else. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something that has been sitting with its own knowledge for a very long time and has learned not to need an audience. You feel it on the prairies when the wind drops and the grass goes still. You feel it in the boreal forest at 3 a.m. when there is no sound but the occasional creak of a branch in cold air. You feel it most powerfully of all when you are standing near one of the structures we have been discussing, one of the places where someone, long before any name was given to this land, chose to mark the earth in a way that has lasted. The silence around those places is the silence of a sentence that was finished long ago, that has been waiting all this time for someone to read it. We have been reading it tonight, but there is more. There is always more, in a country this large and this old, with this deep a human history beneath its surface. And in the hours we have remaining, I want to go deeper into some of the things we touched on earlier, because the stories within the stories are where the most interesting material lives. Let us go back to the medicine wheels, because there is something about them that we have not yet addressed, something that is perhaps the most practically interesting thing about them from the perspective of understanding what the people who built them actually knew. We talked about the astronomical alignments. We talked about the stellar positions encoded in the spoke arrangements. But we have not yet talked about what those alignments were actually for. What was the practical purpose of an astronomical observatory made of stone on a prairie hilltop in southern Alberta 4,000 years ago? The answer, once you think about it, is obvious. And the obviousness of it makes it more interesting, not less. It was a calendar. Not a calendar in the modern sense. Not a grid of days and months printed on paper, but a functional calendar nonetheless. A system for tracking the passage of time with enough precision to anticipate events that had survival consequences. The rising of specific stars on specific horizon positions, particularly at the time of year when those positions coincided with the summer solstice or with the peak of specific seasonal phenomena, told the people who built and used the medicine wheels things they needed to know. When the buffalo were likely to arrive in particular areas, when certain plants would be ready for harvest, when particular weather patterns were likely to begin, when ceremonies needed to be conducted that maintained the relationships between the human community and the powers it depended on. This is not mystical knowledge. This is practical knowledge, expressed in a cosmological framework. The framework looks mystical to modern eyes because we have abstracted our relationship to the seasons to the point where the practical content is invisible. We do not need to know when Aldebaran rises, because our calendar tells us when to plant and our grocery stores supply what we need regardless of the season. But for a people living on the prairies 4,000 years ago, dependent on the movements of animals and the ripening of plants and the patterns of weather that governed both, The ability to predict these things with accuracy was the difference between adequate preparation and catastrophic failure. The medicine wheel builders were not building temples to abstract astronomical gods. They were building instruments. Precise, durable, publicly readable instruments that encoded hard-won calendrical knowledge in a form that could survive the death of any individual because it was written in the landscape itself. Any child who grew up in sight of the medicine wheel, who was taught from an early age to read the alignments, would carry that knowledge as surely as if it had been written in a book, because the book was there on the hilltop, in stone, permanent, renewed by each generation's act of maintaining and reading it. This reframing of the medicine wheels, from religious monuments to astronomical calendars, is not a new idea. It has been developed carefully and rigorously by researchers including Jack Robinson and John Eddy, who did the foundational work on the Bighorn medicine wheel in Wyoming in the 1970s, and whose methods have since been applied to the Canadian examples. The astronomical alignments they documented are real and have been confirmed by multiple independent investigators. The calendar interpretation is the most parsimonious explanation for those alignments. But here is what the calendar interpretation implies that the conventional framework is reluctant to accept. It implies that the people who built the medicine wheels were maintaining, across generations and across the enormous geographic expanse of the northern Great Plains, a coherent and consistent astronomical tradition. Not identical traditions independently developed in multiple places, but the same tradition, shared and transmitted across the whole range. Because the same stellar alignments appear at medicine wheel sites hundreds of kilometers apart, aligned to the same stars on the same dates at the latitude of those sites. That level of consistency across such a large area does not happen by accident. It happens because people were talking to each other. It happens because a knowledge tradition was being maintained and transmitted across distances that required sustained, organized communication over many generations. The existence of that communication network, of that sustained intellectual tradition, is itself a significant discovery. It means that the people of the Canadian Plains 4,000 years ago were not living in the isolated small band structure that the conventional framework assigns to pre-contact North American cultures. They were participating in something larger, a distributed knowledge community that spanned the northern Great Plains and that was sophisticated enough to maintain a consistent astronomical calendar across its entire range. What else was that community maintaining? What other kinds of knowledge were being transmitted along the same networks that kept the stellar alignments consistent across hundreds of kilometers of prairie? These questions do not have answers yet, because the research that would answer them has not been done. But they are the right questions, and they suggest that the story of the medicine wheel builders is not a local story, not a story about one culture in one place doing one interesting thing. It is a story about a civilization of the plains, using that word in its most basic and literal sense, a network of people sharing knowledge and practice across a territory as large as any of the famous ancient civilizations of the Old World. Let us carry that thought forward and apply it to the eastern side of the country, because the same question, the question of what knowledge networks connected the builders of different anomalous structures across Canada, applies with equal force to the eastern evidence. What connected the mound builders of Ontario to the mound builders of Ohio? What connected the copper workers of the Lake Superior region to the trade networks that distributed their products across the continent? What connected the builders of the stone chambers of the Street Quays, Lawrence, to any other tradition of stone chamber construction, whether Indigenous, North American, or potentially Old World? The conventional answer to all of these is diffusion. Ideas traveling along established trade routes from one center of innovation to regions that received and adapted them. This is how archaeology usually explains the spread of cultural practices. A good idea arises somewhere, spreads outward along the paths of contact and exchange, and appears in modified forms across a progressively wider area. The Hopewell tradition's influence in Ontario, the Adena tradition's presence in Atlantic Canada, these are explained as diffusion along the Great Lakes, and Street Lawrence corridor from Ohio and New York State, where the core traditions developed. Diffusion is a real process. It explains a lot, but it has limitations as an explanation when what is being diffused is not a simple technology or a decorative motif, but a complex cosmological and astronomical knowledge system that requires sustained instruction to transmit. You cannot diffuse a calendar by trading a copper bead along a trade route. You can only transmit it by sitting with someone who knows it and having them teach you how it works. This means that the transmission of the kind of knowledge embedded in the medicine wheels and the serpent mounds required sustained personal contact between people who knew the system and people who were learning it. It required something more like schools than like trade routes, something more like an intellectual institution than a simple exchange network. The existence of that kind of intellectual institution in pre-contact North America is not something the conventional framework accommodates. Intellectual institutions of that kind are what we associate with civilizations, with Egypt and Babylon and Greece and Rome and the medieval university. They are not what we associate with the pre-contact cultures of North America, which have been consistently characterized as lacking the kind of social complexity that would make such institutions possible. But the structures suggest otherwise. The structures suggest that something was doing the work of an intellectual institution, maintaining and transmitting complex knowledge over long distances and long periods of time, in a way that left physical traces in the landscape that we are only now beginning to read correctly. What that something was, what it looked like, how it was organized, who participated in it, these are questions that archaeology has not yet answered, because it has not yet asked them with full seriousness. They are questions for the next generation of researchers, working in partnership with the indigenous knowledge traditions that may preserve some memory of how the system functioned. There is a waterway in northern Ontario called the Mississauga River, which flows north from its headwaters in the Canadian Shield, down through boreal forest to Moose River, which empties into James Bay at the southern end of Hudson Bay. The Mississauga has been a travel corridor for Indigenous peoples for as long as there has been anyone to travel it, and along its banks there is a remarkable concentration of petroglyphs, rock art sites carved into the exposed bedrock of the river's shores over a period that may span several thousand years. The Mississauga petroglyphs are not as famous as the Peterborough site, but they share certain characteristics that make them similarly interesting for the questions we have been exploring. Among the animal images and human figures and abstract forms, there are what appears to be astronomical records, marks that seem to track the positions of celestial objects in ways that correspond to specific dates or events. And there are, again, images that some researchers have found difficult to explain within a purely local North American framework. Images that suggest knowledge of, or contact with, things and places beyond the immediate geographic context of the Northern Ontario boreal. The Mississauga corridor connects, via river travel, the interior of Ontario to both James Bay to the north and the Great Lakes to the south. It is one of the natural travel routes across the Canadian Shield, a path that would have been known and used for thousands of years. And the concentration of rock art along its banks suggests that it was not merely a travel route, but a significant place in its own right, a place where travellers stopped and added to an accumulating record that served both practical and ceremonial functions. What the Mississauga petroglyphs are recording, in their full depth and complexity, is not yet fully understood. Serious study of the site has been hampered by its remoteness and by the technical challenges of interpreting rock art in ways that are both methodologically rigorous and respectful of the cultural traditions connected to it. But the site exists. The images are there, and among them are things that challenge comfortable assumptions about what the people who made them knew and how far their knowledge extended. Go west again, this time to the mountains. The Canadian Rockies are among the most dramatic landscapes in the world, and they have been home to human activity for at least 12,000 years, to the length of time since the ice retreated from the mountain valleys and made them accessible to the people who had been waiting in the refugia to the south and east. The mountains are not where you would expect to find evidence of astronomical sophistication or architectural ambition. They are a challenging environment for both, but they are full of high passes and exposed ridges where the sky is close, and the horizon positions of rising and setting celestial objects are visible with great precision. In Banff National Park, and in the adjacent provincial lands to the north and south, there are stone structures on the high ridges that have been documented by hikers and climbers and backpackers for decades, without receiving any systematic archaeological investigation. The structures are what might be generously called viewing platforms, cleared areas of rock, sometimes with small stone walls or windbreaks, oriented towards specific horizon positions that correspond to astronomical events. The clearing, the windbreaks, the orientation, all of these suggest deliberate construction by people who intended to sit in that specific spot and observe the sky from that specific position at specific times. Who built them? The high alpine zone was used in pre-contact times by the peoples of the foothills and the mountain valleys. The Nakoda, the Blackfoot, the Cree, the Stony, for hunting, for vision questing, for gathering specific medicinal plants that grew only at altitude, for ceremonies associated with the high places that many of these traditions hold as sacred. Any or all of these cultures might have built the kinds of structures observed on the Banff ridges, and the astronomical orientations might reflect the same calendrical logic we saw in the prairie medicine wheels, an adaptation of the same underlying knowledge tradition to the specific requirements of the mountain landscape. But here, as so often in this story, the investigation has not been done. The structures sit on the ridges, exposed to weather and to the feet of hikers who do not know what they are looking at. Some of them have been damaged. Others are slowly being buried under accumulating frost debris. And the knowledge that might explain what they were for is held in the oral traditions of the communities associated with the region, traditions that have not been systematically engaged with in connection with these specific features. The story of the Canadian mountains, archaeologically, is very nearly unwritten. The National Park System, which covers much of the most dramatic mountain terrain, has historically prioritized natural history over human history in its interpretive framework, and the archaeology of the mountains has received a fraction of the attention it deserves. What has been found, in the limited investigations that have been done, suggests a human history in the Rockies that is complex and deep, and that connects to the larger story of pre-contact Canada in ways that are only beginning to be understood. Let me tell you about something that was found in a cave, not one of the famous painted caves of France or Spain, not one of the great showcased examples of Ice Age art, but a cave in the interior of British Columbia, a cave that most people in British Columbia have never heard of, that was investigated briefly in the 1990s by a team from the BC archaeological branch, and then effectively forgotten in the literature. The cave is in the karst country of the southern interior, in a region where the underlying limestone has been dissolved by groundwater over millions of years into an elaborate system of passages, chambers, and sinkholes. This kind of karst country is found in scattered patches across the BC interior, and it is the setting for some of the most extraordinary evidence of pre-contact human activity in Western Canada. Cave sites, with stratigraphic sequences going back more than 10,000 years, preserving organic materials that would long since have decomposed in the open air. The specific cave in question, which I will not identify precisely because its location is not publicly disclosed by the Provincial Heritage Authority, contained, when the 1990s investigation reached its deepest accessible layer, something that the team was not expecting. Not cave paintings, though there were red ochre markings at higher stratigraphic levels. Not the usual deposits of flaked stone tools and fire-cracked rock that characterize most interior BC cave sites. What they found, at the lowest accessible level of the cave sediment sequence, was a series of carved stone objects. Not carved pebbles, not shaped stones in the ordinary sense. Deliberately carved stone artifacts showing images, not naturalistic representations of animals or humans, but abstract geometric symbols, repeated consistently across multiple objects, in configurations that the team's report described as suggesting a symbolic system of some kind. The dating of the sediment level in which they were found, based on the stratigraphic context and on radiocarbon dates from associated organic material, placed them at approximately 10,000 to 11,000 years before present. 11,000 years. This pushes the evidence for intentional symbolic marking in British Columbia back into the very early post-glacial period, into the first generations of human presence in the interior after the ice retreated. And the nature of the symbols, geometric and repeated and systematic rather than representational, suggests not individual artistic expression, but something more organized. Something that looks, when you squint at it from the right angle, like the beginning of a notation system. Not writing, not in any form we would recognize as such, but something that is doing part of what writing does, encoding information in a consistent, symbolic form that can be transmitted across time. The 1990s report was filed with the provincial archaeological branch. It was not published in a peer-reviewed journal. The objects, to the best of what can be determined from public records, were accessioned into a provincial collection and have not been the subject of any subsequent investigation or publication. They sit somewhere in a box or a cabinet, labelled and catalogued, waiting for someone to look at them again with the tools and the frameworks that were not available in the 1990s. This is again not an unusual outcome. It is the ordinary outcome for discoveries that do not fit the standard narrative. In a provincial heritage management system that is underfunded and overwhelmed, and that must triage what it can investigate against a constant background of development pressure and competing priorities. The people who filed the report were doing their jobs competently. The system within which they worked was not designed to accommodate findings of this potential significance. And the result is that another piece of the puzzle sits undisturbed in a collection somewhere while the larger picture remains incomplete. The carved stone objects from the British Columbia cave are one data point. They are not proof of a pre-contact notation system in Western Canada. They are not proof of anything by themselves, but they exist. They are real, and they add to the growing list of things that the conventional picture of pre-contact North America does not have room for, and that the conventional institutional framework has not equipped itself to investigate properly. Let us talk now about what happens to anomalous evidence when it encounters the institutional structures that manage Canada's archaeological record. Because the patterns we have been describing, the discovery of something that doesn't fit, the preliminary acknowledgement, the inadequate investigation, the archival burial, these are not random outcomes. They reflect specific structural features of how heritage management and academic archaeology work in Canada, and understanding those features helps explain why so much of this evidence remains unresolved. The first structural feature is the separation between academic research archaeology and regulatory or compliance archaeology. Academic research archaeology, the kind done by universities and research institutions, is driven by research questions and tends to pursue the things that are most interesting from a theoretical standpoint. Regulatory compliance archaeology, the kind mandated by environmental assessment and development permitting processes, is driven by legal requirements and tends to focus on identifying and documenting sites in the path of development so they can be cleared or mitigated. These two streams of archaeology operate largely in parallel, with limited overlap. The anomalous structures we have been discussing tend to fall through the gap between them. Academic researchers interested in pre-contact complexity might be intrigued by the Manitoba alignments or the Lake Huron underwater features, but sustained research funding in Canadian archaeology is limited and tends to flow toward questions that fit within established theoretical frameworks. Compliance archaeology encounters these sites when they appear in the path of development, but compliance archaeology does not have a mandate to pursue open-ended research questions. It has a mandate to document what is present and assess its significance within the regulatory framework, which itself is built on the conventional narrative of pre-contact North American history. If the conventional narrative says that this type of feature should not exist at this location, at this date, the compliance assessment may reflect that assumption, classifying the feature as natural or as non-significant, when the honest answer is that its significance is unknown because the research has not been done. And once a feature is classified as non-significant in a compliance context, it is typically removed from regulatory protection and the development proceeds. The physical evidence is destroyed. The window closes. This is happening across Canada every year as infrastructure development expands into previously undeveloped areas of the country. Pipelines, roads, mines, wind farms, transmission lines. Each of these involves ground disturbance across large areas of territory that have rarely been surveyed archaeologically. Each of them involves, as part of the regulatory process, an archaeological assessment that is designed to find and document what is there before it is disturbed. But those assessments are only as good as the framework within which they operate, and when the framework cannot recognize what it is looking at, the things it cannot recognize are lost. The remedy for this is not to stop developing Canada. The remedy is to invest seriously in the research that would give the regulatory framework the tools it needs to recognize what it might be destroying. That investment requires acknowledging that there is something to find, that the conventional picture is incomplete, that the anomalous structures are not flukes or misidentifications, but evidence of a pre-contact history that deserves to be properly understood before it is buried under a highway interchange. This is a political argument as much as a scientific one. It requires political will, and political will, in the context of Canadian heritage management, depends partly on public awareness, on the people of this country understanding that there is something extraordinary beneath their feet, and that it is being lost, quietly and steadily, in the absence of the attention it deserves. That is one of the reasons that telling this story matters. Not to sensationalize the mysteries, or to promote any particular alternative narrative about who built the structures or where they came from, but to make it clear to as many people as possible that the history of this land is longer and stranger and more worth protecting than most of us have been told. There is a scholar whose name is Barry Breton, not a famous name in archaeology, but a careful researcher who spent the better part of 30 years quietly documenting stone structures in the landscape of eastern Canada, particularly in the maritime provinces of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Breton was not affiliated with any university. He was not publishing in peer-reviewed journals. He was a retired schoolteacher who had grown up in rural Nova Scotia and who had spent his entire life looking at the landscape with the particular attentiveness that comes from knowing a place intimately and being puzzled by things in it that don't fit any explanation you have been given. Breton documented, over those 30 years, hundreds of stone structures across the maritime landscape, chambers, alignments, cairn complexes, platform structures, features in the intertidal zones. He photographed them, he measured them, he noted their orientations and their relationships to each other and to the landscape features around them. He recorded what local people said about them, the oral traditions, and the stories that circulated in the communities near the sites. He was trying to build, from the ground up, an empirical picture of what was actually in the landscape that the official record was not acknowledging. Breton died in 2011, and much of his documentation went with him, preserved only in the notes and photographs he accumulated, but never organized into a systematic publication. His family, understanding the significance of what he had gathered, reached out to several universities and heritage organizations in Atlantic Canada, hoping to find an institutional home for the material. The responses were, with one partial exception, discouraging. Not because anyone thought the material was without value, but because no one had the capacity or the mandate to take it on. The material is now, as far as can be determined, in the possession of one of Breton's grandchildren, in boxes in a house in rural New Brunswick, awaiting the researcher who will eventually understand what it represents. This is the other face of the institutional failure, not just the failure to investigate what is found, but the failure to preserve and build on the work that is done outside the institutions. Canada is full of Barry Bretons, of attentive, diligent people who have spent their lives looking carefully at the landscape and documenting what they see. Some of them are connected to academic institutions that can give their work lasting form. Most are not. And when they die, their work often dies with them or survives in forms too fragmentary to be useful, adding to the general archive of anomalies that no one has the time or the will to properly synthesize. The synthesis, if it were done, would be extraordinary. The accumulated documentation of stone structures across Atlantic Canada, the aerial photography of earthwork features across the prairies, the sonar data from the Great Lakes, the oral history recordings from Indigenous communities across the country, the petroglyphic documentation from BC and Ontario and Labrador, all of this material exists. It is distributed across many hands and many institutions and many basements and many hard drives. What does not exist is the funded, sustained, collaborative research program that would bring it together and ask, seriously and with full rigor, what does it all mean? What would that research program find? We cannot know for certain, because it has not been done, but we can make some informed guesses based on what the individual pieces suggest. It would find that the pre-contact history of Canada extends at least 9,000 to 10,000 years in archaeological time, and probably longer in terms of human presence. It would find that the people present across that long span of time were significantly more architecturally active, more astronomically sophisticated, and more socially organized than the conventional framework allows. It would find that knowledge systems were being maintained and transmitted across large geographic areas and long time periods in ways that imply institutional structures of some kind. Whether or not those structures match any model of institutional organization derived from Old World history, it would find connections between different regions and different time periods that suggest the pre-contact history of Canada was not a collection of isolated local stories, but a single, very long, very complex, and not yet fully understood narrative. And it might find things that nobody has predicted. That is the nature of genuine investigation. When you start asking questions that have not been asked before, with tools that did not previously exist, in partnership with knowledge traditions that have not previously been consulted, you find things you were not looking for. The history of science is full of the things nobody predicted, and the history of Canadian archaeology, which has barely begun to ask the right questions, has a great deal of that kind of surprise ahead of it. Let us spend some time with the silence again, with the specific quality of silence that surrounds these structures when you are in their presence, because there is something in that silence that is not merely the absence of sound, it is the presence of time. The time that has passed since the stones were placed, and the earthworks were raised, and the images were carved. The time that has accumulated around those acts of making, layer by layer, season by season, until what was once immediate and purposeful has become remote and mysterious, and somehow, in its remoteness, more powerful. We experience the past differently depending on how long ago it was. Events within living memory have a different quality from events beyond the reach of anyone who is still alive. Events beyond the oral traditions of any living community have a different quality again. And events from 10,000 years ago, events from the beginning of the post-glacial period, when the landscape of Canada was still emerging from under the ice, and the people who would eventually become the nations of this land were still moving northward into territory that had never before been walked. Those events have a quality of remoteness that is almost physical. They are as far away as anything that is still connected to the world we inhabit. And yet the structures built by the people of that time are here, on the lake floor, on the hilltop, in the forest, in the cleared space above the river. They are here, and they are made of the same material as the land around them, stone and earth and carved rock, and they have been sitting in place long enough to feel as if they grew here, as if the landscape itself produced them in some deep act of geological intention. They feel natural because they are so old, and that feeling of naturalness, that smooth integration into the landscape that comes from very great age, is part of what makes them easy to overlook. They have been here so long that they have begun to look as if they have always been here, as if they are part of what the landscape is, rather than part of what was done to it. But they were done. Someone did them. Someone decided that this stone should be placed here, that this alignment should point there, that this ridge of earth should curve in this direction and end at this point. Someone knew what they were doing, and they did it with enough care and enough competence that what they built has lasted. 10,000 years, in some cases. 5,000 in others. 2,000. The spans are different, but the principle is the same. Someone made something that held. What does it mean to make something that holds for 10,000 years? To build something so durably and place it so carefully in the landscape that it is still there when the climate has cycled through multiple warm and cold phases, when the forests have advanced and retreated and advanced again, when the lake levels have risen and risen again, when every civilization that has ever written itself into the record has risen and been succeeded by something else. What level of intention does that require? What relationship to time does it embody? Not our relationship to time. Not the relationship to time that produces quarterly earnings reports and 5-year plans and monuments designed to last a generation or two before something new replaces them. Something older and slower and more patient. Something that understood the difference between the time of a human life and the time of the land and chose to build at the scale of the land rather than the scale of the life. Something that was, in the truest sense of the word, thinking on a geological timescale, placing marks in the landscape that would endure not for years or decades, but for the kinds of time that only stone and deep cold can accommodate. This quality of intention, this patience with time, is something that modern culture has largely lost, or perhaps more accurately, has not yet had occasion to develop. We are a young civilization in the meaningful sense. We have not yet needed to think on very long timescales, because we have not yet faced the kinds of challenges that require it. The people who built the structures we have been discussing faced those challenges. They faced them on a continent where the climate was unpredictable, where the resources they depended on could disappear without warning, where the collective knowledge that kept the community alive had to be preserved against the constant possibility of disruption. And they responded by building things that would outlast any individual, any generation, any disruption they could foresee. They built for the long term. And the long term, in some cases, turns out to be 10,000 years. There is a lesson in that. Not a comfortable lesson, not a lesson that maps easily onto the challenges of the contemporary world, but a lesson nonetheless. The people who built these structures understood that the world was older than they were, and that the work they were doing was part of a project that extended beyond their own lifetimes in both directions. They were building on what their predecessors had built, and they were building for their successors to build on. They understood themselves as participants in a continuing project rather than as originators of something new. And that understanding, that sense of being part of something larger and longer than a single life or a single generation, was expressed physically in the stones they placed, and the earth they moved, and the images they carved. The medicine wheel on the Alberta hilltop has been there for 4,000 years. It will be there for 4,000 more if we allow it to be. The structures on the floor of Lake Huron have been there for 9,500 years, undisturbed by anything but the slow action of the water above them, waiting for us to develop the technology and the will to find them and understand them. The petroglyphs at Peterborough have been sitting on their marble hillside for up to 1,500 years, speaking in a language that we have not yet fully translated, patient with our slowness to understand them. They were built to last. They have lasted. The only thing that has not lasted is our willingness to take them seriously, to invest in understanding them, to let them tell us what they have to say about the long and complex human history of this land. That willingness is, in some small way, what tonight is about. Staying with the mystery long enough to let it speak, listening to the silence around the structures rather than filling it with easy explanations. Being patient with the questions that do not have answers yet, trusting that the answers exist and that the work of finding them is worth doing. Now, let us visit one more place before we begin the long, slow wind towards sleep. Let us go to the island of Newfoundland, specifically to its interior, to the barren uplands and the bog country that lies between the forest on the coasts and the open rock of the island's central plateau. Because there is a feature in the Newfoundland interior that has been known about for more than a century, that has been visited and described and puzzled over by everyone from 19th century surveyors to 21st century hikers, and that has received almost no serious archaeological investigation. It is a long, low wall of stone, running across the interior plateau for approximately 30 kilometers in a direction that is roughly northeast-southwest. The wall is not dramatic. It is not Hadrian's Wall or the Great Wall of China. It is barely a meter high at its tallest points, and in many places it has tumbled into rubble that you might mistake for a natural outcrop if you were moving through the landscape quickly. But it runs. It continues. It persists for 30 kilometers across terrain where building anything is difficult, where the stone has to be gathered from scattered sources and moved by hand, where the wind and the cold and the distance from any established center of human activity make sustained construction a serious logistical challenge. Who built it? The Mi'kmaq people, whose territory includes the island of Newfoundland, have oral traditions that speak of various features of the interior landscape, but the specific wall is not clearly connected to any tradition of Mi'kmaq construction that archaeologists have documented. The Beothuk, the indigenous people who occupied Newfoundland at the time of European contact and who were tragically exterminated by the early 19th century, are sometimes associated with features of the Newfoundland interior, but the Beothuk were not known as wall builders in the historical record. Norse settlers occupied the very northern tip of the island around 1000 CE, but they left physical remains at Lanceau Meadows that are clearly Norse in character, and a 30-kilometer wall in the interior is not consistent with Norse construction practice in any documented form. The wall sits without a convincing explanation. The surveys that noticed it in the 19th and early 20th centuries noted it and moved on. More recent visitors to the interior plateau who have encountered it have posted photographs online that show exactly what the 19th century surveyors described: a low, continuous wall of laid stone, running across the barrens in a direction that does not correspond to any natural feature of the landscape. It is there. It is man-made. and nobody knows who made it, or when, or why. This is the state of Canadian archaeology in microcosm. The country is full of things like this, full of features that were noticed long ago, described briefly, and then left to wait for an investigation that has not come. The wall on the Newfoundland Plateau is a small mystery. It is not, on its own, evidence of anything dramatic, but it is one more piece of the pattern, one more indication that the pre-contact history of this land includes things that the conventional framework has not accounted for, and that the institutional framework has not yet found the will to investigate. Let us sit with that pattern for a moment, not to draw conclusions that the evidence does not support, not to arrive at a tidy explanation that wraps everything up, but to allow the sheer accumulation of it to make the impression it deserves, because the accumulation is significant. The medicine wheels of Alberta, the serpent mound of Ontario, the underwater features of Lake Huron, the stone chambers of the St. Lawrence, the petroglyphs of Peterborough, the BC petroglyph astronomical alignments, the Manitoba subarctic alignments, the carved stones of the BC cave, the Atlantic Canada stone chambers, the Manitoba copper mines, the Oak Island engineering, the wall on the Newfoundland Plateau, the cairn complexes of Labrador, the ridge structures of the Okanagan lake bed, the anomalous sonar features of Lake Ontario. These are not one mystery, they are many mysteries, but they share a common character. They are evidence of human activity in pre-contact Canada that does not fit the conventional picture of what was here. They suggest complexity, organization, astronomical sophistication, architectural ambition, and possibly transcontinental or transoceanic connection across a time frame and a geographic range that the standard narrative of North American prehistory does not accommodate. The standard narrative will change. It always does. Every significant advance in our understanding of the human past has involved revising a narrative that seemed, at the time, well established and adequate. The discovery that the peopling of the Americas was significantly earlier than previously thought, the recognition that Neanderthals and modern humans interbred, the realization that agriculture was independently invented in multiple places, rather than spreading from a single origin. Each of these was a revision of something that the previous generation had considered settled, and each of them opened up new questions that the revised framework could begin to address. The revision of the narrative of pre-contact Canada is coming. The evidence is accumulating too rapidly and from too many directions to be ignored indefinitely. The collaborative methodologies that bring Indigenous knowledge and academic archaeology into genuine partnership are producing results too significant to be marginalized. The technology for investigating underwater and subsurface features is improving faster than any previous generation would have thought possible. The political and social context is shifting in ways that make the suppression of Indigenous historical knowledge less tenable than it once was. When the revision comes, it will change not just the story of Canada, but the story of the world. Because the story of pre-contact North America is part of the story of human civilization globally, and a revised understanding of what was here before European contact will require a revised understanding of what was happening in the world during the long millennia when this continent's extraordinary human history was unfolding. Beyond the awareness of any old world observer, that revised understanding will be, if it is built on honest investigation and genuine collaboration, one of the most fascinating intellectual achievements of the 21st century. It will open up new questions about the origins of astronomical knowledge, about the development of architectural traditions, about the mechanisms of long-distance cultural transmission, about the pace and complexity of social evolution in non-agricultural contexts, and about the relationship between the intellectual traditions of the pre-contact Americas and the intellectual traditions of the Old World. It will be a profound expansion of what we know about what human beings are capable of and how long they have been capable of it. For now, though, the mysteries remain. The structures sit in their various places across the enormous landscape of Canada, doing what very old things do, being patient, being present, waiting. And you are listening to this from wherever you are, in whatever city or town or rural place you happen to occupy, lying in the dark or sitting in the quiet of a late hour, letting the strangeness of it settle. The strangeness of a land that is so much older in its human history than the history it is usually given credit for. the strangeness of structures that nobody can fully explain, built by people who understood things we are still trying to understand, placed in the landscape with an intention and a precision that 5,000 years of weather has not managed to erase. The land beneath you is old. The history beneath the land is older still. And the questions it raises are the most interesting kind, the ones that point toward knowledge that is genuinely new, genuinely expanding, genuinely revelatory. Questions that lead not to comfortable confirmation of what we already believed, but to the uncomfortable, wonderful frontier where what we know gives way to what we are only beginning to suspect. That frontier is worth exploring. These structures are worth understanding. This history is worth telling. And the silence around all of it, the long silence that has covered pre-contact Canada for the centuries since the first Europeans arrived and began writing a history that began with themselves, that silence is beginning to break. Not dramatically, not all at once, but here and there, in a research paper published by a collaborative team, in a sonar image that shows what wasn't supposed to be there, in a radiocarbon date that places human activity at a site 5,000 years before the conventional timeline allows, in an elder's voice speaking about places that the records say no one should have been, the silence is breaking. And what is emerging from it is something that this country has owed to itself and to the world for a very long time. The true history of Canada, the whole history, the history that includes what was here before anyone wrote anything down, and what was built, and what was known, and what was done, across all the millennia of human presence on this ancient and remarkable land. That history is still being discovered. Tonight, lying in the dark wherever you are, you have followed part of its outline. The parts that are known, the parts that are suspected, the parts that are still entirely mysterious, the spaces between the things we know, where the most interesting discoveries are waiting. Sleep well now. Let the images from tonight settle into the deeper levels of your mind where the interesting things go. The submerged stones on the lake floor, the medicine wheel spokes, pointing at a star that rose on the summer solstice 4,000 years ago, the carved serpent above the Ontario water, the long wall across the Newfoundland plateau, the chambers under the Montreal streets, the copper the lake gave up in quantities that still have not been fully accounted for. These things are real, they are there. The landscape of Canada is full of them, and the story of what they mean, told fully and honestly, and with all the patience that very old mysteries deserve, is one of the great unfinished stories in the history of human knowledge. Rest now. The structures will be there in the morning, and there will be more to say about them. There is always more to say. This land has been keeping its secrets for 10,000 years. It is in no hurry to give them all up at once, and neither are we. Good night. And if you have made it this far, all the way to the end of this long, slow journey into the deep past of a country that contains more mystery than most of its residents suspect, then leave a comment wherever you are in the world, and whatever time it is there. The night comments, the 3am comments, the comments from the boreal and the prairie and the coast, they are always the most interesting. They are their own kind of connection across the darkness, a kind that these ancient structures, placed to mark relationships across time and space, would recognize. Take care of yourself, and pay attention to the ground you walk on. It has more to say than you have been told. There is a question that sits underneath everything we have discussed tonight, a question that the individual mysteries gesture toward, but that none of them, in isolation, fully asks. It is the question of memory, of how a people remember something that happened so long ago that no living person witnessed it, no writing recorded it, and no monument from the original event survives in recognizable form. The question of how knowledge persists across the kind of time we have been discussing, across 5,000 or 8,000 or 10,000 years, through every disruption that the natural and human world can produce. The conventional answer, the one that most people in the modern world would give without much reflection, is that it cannot. That knowledge of this kind cannot survive without writing, without institutions, without the specific technologies of preservation that civilization has developed to protect information against time. That before those technologies existed, the past was simply lost, except for what archaeology could later recover from the physical traces left in the ground. But this answer is wrong. We know it is wrong because we have examples that demonstrate it is wrong. We have the Australian Aboriginal oral traditions that preserve accurate coastal geography from before the sea levels rose 10,000 years ago. We have the Homeric epics, which are now understood to preserve geographical and social information from the Bronze Age Mycenaean civilization that collapsed more than 3,000 years before they were written down. We have the Vedic oral tradition of India, which preserved the Vedas for over 1,000 years of oral transmission before they were committed to writing, with a level of accuracy that makes their textual stability remarkable by any standard. We have the oral traditions of indigenous peoples across North America, which have preserved information about landscapes, species, celestial events, and social arrangements across spans of time that written records have barely begun to approach. Oral tradition is not a degraded form of history. It is a different form of history, one that operates by different rules and preserves different kinds of information, but that is, under the right conditions and within the right kinds of communities, extraordinarily robust. The right conditions include regular, structured transmission from one generation to the next, embedded in ceremonies and ritual contexts that give the content emotional weight and mnemonic structure. They include communities of practice that check and correct each other's recollections. They include a cultural framework that treats accurate transmission as a sacred obligation rather than an optional embellishment. Under these conditions, oral tradition can preserve information accurately across spans of time that would amaze anyone who assumed the only reliable form of historical memory was writing. The oral traditions of the Indigenous peoples of Canada include information about the land that is precisely the kind of long-span geographic and astronomical memory we have been discussing. Traditions that describe landscapes at water levels different from today. Traditions that speak of structures and places whose physical correlates archaeologists are only now beginning to find. Traditions that preserve astronomical knowledge about specific star positions and specific seasonal events, that would have required the kind of systematic observation we associate with the medicine wheels and the petroglyphs and the other astronomical structures we have documented. This is not a coincidence. The oral traditions and the physical structures are part of the same knowledge system. The people who maintained the traditions were the same people, over the long span of generations, who built and maintained and used the structures. The structures encoded the knowledge in physical form. The traditions preserved the context and the meaning. Together, they constituted a complete system for transmitting critical information across time. The information about when and where and how to do the things that kept the community alive and flourishing. When that system was disrupted, when the residential schools removed children from their communities and suppressed their languages and broke the transmission chain, the knowledge did not simply vanish. It went underground. It was preserved in fragments, in elders who had been sent to school too late to have their transmission broken, in communities in more remote areas that the residential school system reached less completely, in the memories of people who had heard things before the suppression that they carried secretly because they understood, even as children, that what they were hearing was important. The recovery of that knowledge, the painstaking work of reconnecting fragments, of eliciting what elders still carry, of cross-referencing oral tradition with physical evidence and astronomical data and archaeological record, is one of the most important intellectual projects of our time. It is being done, quietly, carefully, with the kind of patience that very long timescales require. And what it is recovering is, in some cases, exactly the context that the physical structures have been waiting for. The knowledge that explains why the stones are placed where they are placed, what they were for, what they were tracking, what they encoded. There is a researcher, I will call her Margaret, because she has asked not to be identified by name in connection with work that is not yet published, who has been doing this recovery work in Northern Ontario for the past 15 years. She works in partnership with an Anishinaabe community whose territory includes a series of stone structures along the shore of a lake that the conventional archaeological record has described as fish weirs or unidentified stone, features of uncertain date and function. She has been working with elders in the community, recording conversations, sitting through long evenings in which stories come out in fragments, not in the form of systematic historical accounts, but in the form that oral tradition usually takes, embedded in other stories, attached to specific places, connected to specific ceremonies. What she has learned over 15 years of this work is that the stone structures on the lakeshore are not fish weirs. The elders know what fish weirs look like. The structures on the shore are not those things. They are markers. Specifically, they are markers that track the position of a specific star cluster, the Pleiades, at a specific time of year when the lake is safe to cross on ice. The structures are oriented to show, from a specific standpoint on the shore, when the Pleiades have risen to the position that indicates the ice is thick enough to bear weight. This is practical knowledge, survival knowledge, encoded in stone and preserved in oral tradition and used, within living memory of the elders she works with, by people crossing the lake in winter. When Margaret mapped the structures and verified their astronomical orientations, she found that they were precisely calibrated, not approximately, not roughly, precisely, to a degree that required careful measurement and repeated observation over multiple seasons to achieve. The people who built them knew what they were doing. They understood the relationship between stellar position and seasonal ice conditions well enough to encode it in a physical marker that generations of lake travelers could use without having to carry the full astronomical knowledge that went into building it. They built a tool that worked, and the tool has been waiting on the lakeshore, misidentified as a fish weir in the archaeological record for however long it has been there. This is what the collaborative work produces, not dramatic revelations, not single great discoveries that overturn everything at once, but the quiet, patient accumulation of understanding, piece by piece, structure by structure, tradition by tradition, that gradually builds a picture of what was here and what it was for that the conventional record, working alone, could never have assembled. There are hundreds of stories like this waiting to be told. Across Canada, in every region and every cultural territory, there are structures that the conventional record has misidentified or failed to understand. And there are oral traditions that carry the context that would explain them. And there are researchers doing the patient collaborative work of bringing the two together. The work is slow because the timescales involved are long, and the knowledge involved is complex, and the relationships involved require sustained trust. But it is progressing. And as it progresses, the picture of pre-contact Canada is changing. Not dramatically, not in the sensational way of popular alternative history, but in the profound and lasting way of genuine discovery, a discovery that does not replace the conventional narrative with a single alternative, but that layers additional complexity and depth onto what was there, revealing a pre-contact North America that was more sophisticated, more organized, more interconnected, and more ancient in its traditions than anyone had given it credit for. The Great Lakes themselves carry a kind of testimony that we have touched on, but not exhausted. The lakes are more than bodies of water. They are, in the context of pre-contact North American history, the most significant transportation and communication network on the continent. The 5 lakes together, connected to each other and to the St. Lawrence and through it to the Atlantic Ocean, form a water highway of extraordinary reach. You can travel by canoe from the western end of Lake Superior to the Gulf of St. Lawrence without leaving the water system. You can connect, via the river systems that empty into the Great Lakes, to territories that span from the Rocky Mountains to the Appalachians and from the Hudson Bay watershed to the Gulf of Mexico. This connectivity was not lost on the peoples of pre-contact North America. The Great Lakes Corridor was the main artery of exchange and communication across the eastern half of the continent for thousands of years. The Hopewell tradition's reach, which distributed its distinctive artifacts and its religious and ceremonial practices across an enormous area centered on the Ohio Valley, was carried primarily by canoe travel along the Great Lakes system and its tributary rivers. The copper of the Lake Superior mines moved along this system to all points of the compass. The ideas encoded in the medicine wheels and the serpent mounds and the stone chambers traveled along the same routes, carried in the memories of the people who paddled and portaged across the landscape. The lakes, in this sense, are not just settings for the story, they are characters in it. They are the medium through which the knowledge traditions of pre-contact Canada moved and spread and accumulated. And the things that lie on their floors, the submerged evidence of the landscapes that were above water during the periods of lower lake levels, are potentially some of the most significant archaeological evidence in the country because they were preserved by the rising water rather than destroyed by it, sealed against disturbance for thousands of years in the cold and the dark. The potential of the underwater record in the Great Lakes has barely been touched. The Alpena Amberley discovery in Lake Huron is the most significant investigation to date, and it has produced evidence of human activity at dates and of a complexity that the conventional framework was not expecting. But Alpena Amberley is one area of one lake. The other four Great Lakes, and the thousands of square kilometers of their floors that correspond to formerly inhabited land surfaces, have received only the most cursory investigation. What is down there is, by any reasonable estimate, extraordinary. The preserved remnants of camps and settlements and structures from thousands of years of human activity on landscapes that are now 20, 40, 100 meters underwater, organic materials that have not decomposed, beaches that have not been disturbed by agriculture or construction, or the ordinary processes of a landscape that was still above water and still being used. The technology exists to investigate these sites: remotely operated vehicles, precision sonar mapping, underwater photogrammetry, DNA analysis of sediment samples that can identify the plant species that once grew on the now submerged surface. The technology exists, and it has been used in comparable investigations in other parts of the world, in the North Sea, in the Black Sea, in the waters off the coasts of Australia, where submerged prehistoric landscapes have been investigated with results that have fundamentally changed our understanding of human prehistory in those regions. What is missing, in the case of the Great Lakes, is the investment. The sustained, deliberate, well-funded program of underwater archaeological investigation that would bring the full suite of available technologies to bear on the question of what is on the lake floors and what it means. That investment has not been made, partly because the lakes are large and the investigation is expensive and the immediate practical benefit is hard to quantify. But the cultural and historical benefit, the contribution to our understanding of who was here and what they knew and what they built, is incalculable. There will come a time when some of this investigation is done, when the technology is cheaper, or the funding is available, or the political will is there, or some combination of all three. And when it is done, the results will surprise everyone who is still operating with the conventional picture of pre-contact North American history. Because what is down there, whatever it is, has been preserved through the extraordinary accident of the rising lake levels, sealed in cold water for 9,000 or 10,000 years, waiting for the moment when we are ready to look. That moment has not yet come for most of the Great Lakes, but it is approaching, and the anticipation of it is itself a kind of testimony to how much we are about to learn about this land and its long human history. Let us come back to the surface. Let us come back to the land of forests and prairies and mountains, to the landscape that we can walk through and touch and smell, to the place where the mystery lives most immediately and most insistently. Because for all the extraordinary potential of the underwater record, it is the structures on the land, the ones you can stand beside and touch and look at and puzzle over, that carry the most immediate emotional weight, that make the mystery feel most present and most urgent. There is a place in the Qu'Appelle Valley, in southern Saskatchewan, a deep glacially carved valley that runs like a long wound through the flat prairie, where a series of earthen features has been known to local people for as long as anyone can remember. The valley is beautiful in its own austere way, steep-sided, with the prairie rising flat to the horizon on both edges, and the bottom threaded with a chain of lakes left by the retreating glacier. The Qu'Appelle has been inhabited continuously for a very long time. It was a major corridor of travel and settlement for the plains peoples, sheltered from the wind and reliably watered in a landscape that is neither. The earthen features in the Qu'Appelle are not the most dramatic things in Canadian archaeology. They are not large. They do not dominate the landscape or announce themselves visually. They are low mounds and subtle depressions and faint linear features in the valley floor and on the terraces above it. The kind of thing that shows up clearly on aerial photography, but that would take a careful and experienced eye to notice on the ground. Some of them have been investigated, briefly and incompletely, by provincial archaeologists over the past several decades. Others have been noted in survey reports and left uninvestigated. Together they form a palimpsest, a landscape written on repeatedly by many hands over many thousands of years, each layer partially obscuring the layers beneath. What makes the Qu'Appelle features interesting for our purposes is not any single element, but the pattern they form when you step back far enough to see all of them together. The pattern, which can be seen in the accumulated survey data from 50 years of intermittent investigation in the valley, is of a landscape that was organized, not randomly occupied, not visited and revisited without pattern, but deliberately organized according to some spatial logic that governed where certain things were done and how the different parts of the valley related to each other. The mounds cluster in ways that suggest deliberate placement rather than the random distribution you would expect from repeated camping in the most practical locations. The linear features align with each other and with the valley's larger geometry in ways that suggest a planned relationship rather than independent construction. The high terrace sites, where the views of the valley are widest, show the most evidence of repeated occupation and the most complex surface features, as if they were chosen specifically for what you could see from them, rather than for any practical shelter or resource advantage. This kind of spatial organization, this landscape-level intentionality, is what some archaeologists call a cultural landscape, a natural environment that has been systematically modified and organized over time to reflect the social and cosmological framework of the people who inhabit it. Cultural landscapes are documented across the world, from the sacred mountains of Japan to the pilgrimage routes of medieval Europe to the songlines of Australia, and they are understood as one of the most sophisticated forms of relationship that a human community can develop with its physical environment, not just living in the land, but organizing the land to reflect and reinforce the community's understanding of itself and its place in the cosmos. If the Qu'Appelle Valley is a cultural landscape in this sense, if its spatial organization reflects a deliberate, centuries-long project of landscape modification that expressed the social and cosmological framework of the communities who lived there, then it is one of the most significant archaeological features of the Canadian prairies. It is evidence of a relationship to place that goes far beyond simple resource exploitation, that reflects a sophistication of environmental engagement that the conventional picture of pre-contact plains cultures has not generally attributed to them. And the Qu'Appelle is not unique. The same kind of spatial organization, the same evidence of deliberate landscape-level intentionality appears in other Canadian valleys and other Canadian landscapes when you look for it, in the Okanagan, in the Gatineau, in the river valleys of the Maritimes, in the fjords of the BC coast. The cultural landscape, the deliberately organized environment that reflects a human community's understanding of its relationship to place and cosmos, is not a single site. It is a mode of inhabiting the land that appears to have been practiced, in different forms and at different scales, across pre-contact Canada. Understanding this mode of inhabiting the land, understanding what the spatial organization of these landscapes was expressing and encoding and preserving, is one of the great tasks that lies ahead for the archaeology of pre-contact Canada. It is a task that requires the full collaboration between the physical record, which archaeology can document, and the oral traditions, which carry the knowledge of what the physical organization meant, and the land itself, which holds in its shapes and its orientations and its internal relationships the evidence of the decisions that were made about it long ago. This is the work. This is the project. Not the dramatic single discovery, not the treasure at the bottom of the shaft, not the inscription that proves a single conclusive thesis about who was here and where they came from. The work is the patient, collaborative, methodologically rigorous process of learning to read a landscape that has been inscribed over thousands of years by people who understood it in ways that we are only beginning to recover. That work will take time, more time than any individual researcher's career, more time than any single funding cycle or any single institutional mandate. It is work that will be done across generations, with each generation adding to what the previous one built, in exactly the same way that the people who built the structures we have been discussing added to what their predecessors had started. It is a project that requires the same quality of intention that went into those structures, the same willingness to do something for the long term that may not be completed in any single lifetime. But it is beginning, and that is something. In a country that for too long told itself a history that started with the arrival of Europeans, the recognition that there is a much longer and much richer history to be understood, and the beginning of the serious work of understanding it, is itself a significant development. Not everything that needs to change has changed. Not everything that needs to be investigated has been investigated. Not everything that needs to be heard has been listened to, but the direction is right, and the momentum is building. Lie back now. We are approaching the end of this particular journey, though the journey into the deep history of Canada is, as I hope is now clear, one that will never have a final destination. There will always be more to find, more to understand, more to ask. The ground is too rich and the history too deep, and the questions too good for the journey ever to be complete. But for For this hour, or this set of hours, wherever you are in the long, slow dissolve towards sleep, let the images settle. The prairie hilltop with its wheel of stones, spoke by spoke in the grass. The lake floor with its structures, 10 meters down, 20, 100, cold and dark and perfectly preserved. The marble hillside at Peterborough with its 900 images, including the boats that nobody can fully explain. The serpent undulating above the water in Ontario. The chambers that the Montreal workers found and then lost. The wall across the Newfoundland plateau. The cave in British Columbia with its carved stones, 11,000 years old, and still waiting for the investigation they deserve. All of these things are real. All of these things are in Canada. All of them are part of a history that this country has not yet fully acknowledged or understood. And all of them are waiting, with the enormous patience of very old things, for the moment when we are finally ready to take them seriously, to invest in understanding them, to let them tell us what they know about the long human presence on this extraordinary land. You have followed that presence tonight, through time and across the landscape, from the lake floors to the mountain ridges, from the Atlantic provinces to the Pacific coast, from the edge of the boreal to the subarctic tundra. You have heard about things that historians cannot yet explain, and you have heard why the explanation has not yet come, and you have heard that it is coming, slowly, carefully, the way the best discoveries always come, not with a dramatic single moment of revelation, but with the gradual accumulation of understanding that eventually reaches a tipping point and changes everything. Canada is approaching that tipping point. The evidence is there. The tools are getting better. The frameworks are expanding. The collaborations are deepening. And the land itself, enormous and cold and patient and full of structures that nobody built by accident, is waiting for the moment when we finally look at it with the seriousness it has always deserved. Sleep well. Dream of old things. The ground beneath you is full of them. There is a particular kind of knowing that comes only from sitting with something long enough. Not the knowing of a quick glance, not the knowing of a fact absorbed and filed, but the knowing that accumulates the way sediment accumulates, layer by layer, slow and patient, building something that will eventually be solid enough to stand on. The history of Canada's pre-contact past has, for most of the time that people have been trying to understand it, been the subject of the first kind of knowing. The quick glance, the rapid classification, the fact filed and set aside. What it has needed, and what it is only now beginning to receive, is the second kind, the long sitting, the patient accumulation. We have been sitting with it tonight, and in the sitting, some things have become clearer that were not clear before. Not answers to the specific mysteries, those remain, genuinely, mysterious. But something about the shape of the mystery, something about the kind of question we are actually asking when we ask about the structures beneath Canada. We are not asking, when we ask about these structures, whether some great lost civilization built them. The romantic version of that story, the version that involves Atlantis or ancient astronauts, or a single grand progenitor culture that taught civilization to the world, is not what the evidence supports. The evidence supports something more complex, and in its own way, more interesting. Not a lost civilization, but a lost complexity. A complexity of pre-contact North American culture that was real, that left physical traces that we are finding more of every year, that was as sophisticated and as organized and as astronomically aware as the evidence consistently shows it to have been. And that was, for the most part, not one thing but many things. Many cultures, many traditions, many approaches to the fundamental human projects of knowing and marking and organizing and transmitting. That complexity was lost, or rather, was made invisible, by the collision of two very different ways of being in the world. The world that arrived from Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, and that spread across the continent in the centuries that followed, brought with it not just diseases and weapons and trade goods, but a framework for understanding what counted as civilization, what counted as history, what counted as knowledge worth preserving. That framework was built on writing, on permanent settlement, on the specific forms of social organization that European civilization had developed over millennia in a particular geographic and cultural context. And it was a framework that did not have room in it for what it found here. For cultures that organized knowledge in oral tradition rather than written text, that moved with the seasons rather than building permanently in one place, that marked the landscape in ways that were not recognizable as architecture from the European perspective, that maintained astronomical traditions in stone rather than in papyrus. The failure to recognize pre-contact North American complexity was, in part, a failure of framework, not a failure of perception, not a failure of intelligence, but a failure of the conceptual tools available to the people making the observations. They looked at the medicine wheels and saw crude stone arrangements because they did not know how to read an astronomical calendar encoded in stone. They looked at the earthworks and saw mounds because the concept of a deliberate serpent form built at landscape scale was outside the range of what they expected to find. They looked at the oral traditions and saw myth because they did not yet have the methodological tools to understand how much real, historical, and geographical information those traditions could carry. We have better tools now. We have radiocarbon dating and dendrochronology, and optically stimulated luminescence dating, and archaeoastronomy, and underwater archaeology, and satellite remote sensing, and ancient DNA analysis, and all the other methodological advances that have transformed archaeology in the past 50 years. We have the beginnings of collaborative frameworks that bring Indigenous knowledge into genuine partnership with academic research. We have a political and cultural context, however imperfect and contested, that at least acknowledges in principle the importance of taking Indigenous history seriously. We are better equipped than any previous generation to ask the questions the structures raise and to find answers that are genuinely adequate to the evidence. What we lack, still, is the collective will to invest in the asking. The sustained, serious, well-funded program of investigation that would bring the full suite of available tools to bear on the full range of anomalous evidence across the country. The institutional commitment to collaborative research that would make Indigenous knowledge genuinely central rather than consultatively peripheral. The cultural shift that would make the deep pre-contact history of Canada as much a part of the national identity and national curiosity as the better-known events of the post-contact centuries. That shift is coming. It cannot not come, given the direction that everything is moving. The evidence is too abundant and too accessible and too well documented to be indefinitely ignored. The Indigenous communities whose historical knowledge holds the keys to understanding much of what the physical evidence cannot explain by itself are increasingly well positioned to advocate for the research that their history deserves. The tools are getting better. The awareness is growing. The tipping point, as I said before, is approaching. And when it comes, it will change this country's relationship to itself, to its own past, to its own land. Canada is a country that has sometimes struggled with the question of identity, of what it is and what it stands for, beyond the political and geographic accident of not being the United States. The answer to that question, or at least a significant part of it, is underground. It is on the lake floors. It is in the alignment of stones, on the prairie hilltop. It is in the oral traditions of communities that have been here for 10,000 years and that have been keeping the real story of this land alive through everything that was done to suppress it. The real story of Canada is not a story that begins in 1534 with Jacques Cartier entering the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It begins much earlier. It begins with the first human feet on a post-glacial landscape, following the retreating ice northward into a world that had never been walked by human beings. It begins with the first stone placed deliberately on this ground, for whatever reason, by whatever hand, in whatever relationship to the world, that the person who placed it understood themselves to be in. It begins with the first story told about this land, in whatever language, preserved in whatever form, carrying whatever knowledge about the sky and the water and the animals and the plants and the patterns of time that would help the people who came after stay alive in it. That story has never stopped being told. It has been suppressed, interrupted, damaged, partially lost. But it has never stopped. And the structures, the ones we have been discussing tonight, are part of its telling. They are the physical record of a story that was also being told in words and in ceremony, and in the careful transmission of knowledge from elder to child, across more generations than any written history can span. Tonight, we have listened to part of that story, not enough of it, never enough of it, but part. And the part we have heard is enough to know that the rest is worth listening for. That the structures beneath Canada, and above it, and on its lake floors, and in its forests, and on its hilltops, and in the memory of the people who have been here the longest, are telling something real, something that this country and this world needs to hear. The question is only whether we are willing to listen. I think we are getting there slowly, with the patient, accumulating speed of something that has been waiting a very long time and that knows there is no hurrying. The moment when the weight of evidence finally tips the balance and the picture changes and what was invisible becomes seen. In the meantime, the night is quiet wherever you are. The structures are where they have always been. The stars are where they have always been, circling over the same land that the medicine wheel builders watched them from, the same sky that the Peterborough carvers looked up at, the same darkness that the people on the Newfoundland plateau moved through on their way to wherever they were going. And you are here, in the dark, at whatever hour this finds you, having followed the thread of this long and unresolved mystery through all its turns and complications and open questions. Having sat with the uncertainty that is the most honest response to evidence that is real but not yet fully understood. Having let the landscape of pre-contact Canada, with all its buried and submerged and overlooked structures, become a little more present in your imagination than it was before. That is enough for tonight. That is more than enough. The best thinking happens in the space between knowing and not knowing, in the place where curiosity is alive and the question has not yet been foreclosed by an answer that may be wrong or incomplete. You have been in that space tonight. It is a good place to be. It is, in its own way, the most interesting place in the history of knowledge. Sleep now. Let the images settle. The medicine wheels spinning on the prairie hilltops, the serpent mound above the Ontario water, the lake floors with their stone arrangements, sealed in cold darkness for 9,000 years. The carved images on the white marble at Peterborough, speaking in a language we are only beginning to learn. The long wall on the Newfoundland plateau, running across the barrens in a direction nobody has yet explained. The chambers under the Montreal streets, described and then destroyed, and now only a rumour in the provincial archive. The cairns in the Labrador interior, pointing at something on the horizon that matters, even if we no longer know what. All of these things are there, all of them are waiting, and the story they are part of, the long, deep, complex, extraordinary story of human presence on this ancient land, is one of the most important stories that this country has yet to fully tell itself. It is getting there, and so are you, toward the sleep that is waiting, at the end of a long journey through time and mystery and the patient evidence of old things. Good night, rest well. The morning will bring its own questions, and the ground will still be full of answers, waiting to be asked. Let me tell you about the sound that a forest makes at 3 a.m. in January in northern Canada. Not the wind, though the wind is there. Not the creak of branches in cold air, though that is there too. There is an undertone to the Canadian winter forest at that hour that is harder to describe, a deep, structural silence that feels less like the absence of sound and more like the presence of something that does not need sound to communicate. The trees know what they are. The rock beneath them knows what it is. The snow knows its own weight and its own depth and its own slow downward progress. And in the places where structures were built, the old structures, the ones we have been following tonight, that silence has an additional quality, a kind of pressure, the sense of something having been decided here, long ago, and remaining decided, the sense of intention that has outlasted every circumstance that could have dissolved it. I have been thinking about that silence through the hours we have spent together tonight, about what it holds, about what it is made of, because the silence around very old structures is not simply the absence of the people who made them. It is the presence of the time that has passed since they were made. Every year that has gone by since the last stone was placed, since the last image was carved, since the last ceremony was conducted at the site, has added its layer to what the silence is. And the total weight of 10,000 years of silence, 10,000 years of winters and summers, and the slow movement of ice and the slower movement of rock, is something that you feel in your chest when you are standing beside one of these places, if you are paying the right kind of attention. The people who built the structures we have been discussing tonight were paying that kind of attention, not to the silence, because the silence was not there yet when they were there. They were paying attention to something else, to the sky, to the horizon, to the positions of stars and sun and moon, to the relationships between the land and the light at specific moments of the year. They were paying attention to the world with an intensity that most modern people, surrounded by the noise and the information and the constant demand for cognitive processing that modern life requires, can barely imagine. The kind of attention that comes from knowing that what you are looking at matters, that getting it wrong has consequences, that the knowledge encoded in what you observe is the difference between adequate preparation and catastrophic failure. That attention is what produced the structures, the medicine wheels with their precise stellar alignments, the serpent mound with its solstice orientation, the stone circles on the lake floor, the petroglyphs with their astronomical records. All of these were produced by sustained, disciplined, multi-generational attention to the world, by people who had decided that the world was worth paying attention to, that the sky was worth watching night after night for decades and centuries, that the results of that watching were worth encoding in forms durable enough to outlast any individual and to teach what had been learned to anyone who came after. This is one of the things that strikes me most deeply about the evidence we have been examining. Not just what was built, but the quality of attention that went into building it. The attention of people who understood themselves to be embedded in a world that had its own order and its own patterns, and who took it as a fundamental task of being human to understand those patterns and to mark them and to pass the understanding of them on. The attention of people who thought in timescales longer than a single life, who placed stones not for themselves, but for the people who would come after them and need to know where Aldebaran rose on the summer solstice horizon. The attention of people who took seriously the idea that their responsibility to the future was as real as their responsibility to the present. That quality of attention is not alien to us. We have it, or we can have it, when we choose to exercise it. When we slow down enough, when we quiet the noise enough, when we let the world have the space to show us what it is. The problem is that most of the structures of modern life work against this kind of attention rather than for it. The notifications and the deadlines and the constant stream of information that demands to be processed, all of these crowd out the slower, deeper attention that produces the kind of knowledge that gets encoded in stone on a prairie hilltop for 4,000 years. And yet the capacity is there. It is part of what we are. The same nervous system that was developed over hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution to pay the kind of close, sustained, consequential attention to the world that produced the medicine wheels and the stone circles is the nervous system you are using right now to follow this story. The same capacity for pattern recognition, for understanding relationships over long time spans, for encoding knowledge in durable forms, is available to us. We have simply, for the most part, pointed it elsewhere. The structures of pre-contact Canada are a reminder of what that capacity is for. Not a romantic reminder, not a call to abandon modernity and return to a lifestyle that most of us would find impossible and exhausting and often terrifying, but a reminder, nonetheless, that the human mind at its best is capable of the kind of long, patient, consequential engagement with the world that left those marks in the landscape, and that the world, for its part, is still there, still available to that kind of engagement, still capable of teaching what it taught the people who built the structures, if we can find the time and the quiet to ask. There is a particular kind of question that the very old structures of Canada ask of their visitors when the visitors are paying enough attention to hear it. The question is not, who built me? That is the question the tourist asks, the question of attribution and narrative, the question that wants a name and a date and a story to attach to what the eyes are seeing. The question the structures ask, when you are quiet enough to hear it, is simpler and more demanding. It is, what are you paying attention to? What are you paying attention to? Not what do you know, not what have you been told, not what does the label on the interpretive sign say, but what, in this moment, standing here on this ground, or lying in this bed, or sitting in this chair, in this particular configuration of time and space and consciousness, are you actually attending to? What has your attention? Where is it? How deep does it go? These are the questions that very old things ask when you give them the chance. They ask them not in words, but in the quality of presence they carry, in the weight of time that has accumulated around them, in the silence that holds them. And the answer to them, whatever it turns out to be for you in this particular moment, is a form of taking stock, of checking in with yourself about whether you are, in fact, present to the world that you are part of, or whether you have been somewhere else, in the noise and the information and the processing, too long. For tonight, for however long this voice has been in your ears and these images have been in your mind, you have been attending to something real and old and genuinely mysterious. You have followed the thread of structures and evidence and questions across the enormous landscape of a country that most of the world thinks it knows, but that in fact contains depths of history that have barely been explored. You have sat with the uncertainty that is the most honest response to evidence that is real but not yet fully understood. You have let the pre-contact past of Canada become a little more present, a little more three-dimensional, a little more complex and interesting, and worth taking seriously than it probably was before you started listening. That is a good use of time. Whether you are on the edge of sleep, or already most of the way there, whether the images we have been building together have already dissolved into the looser, stranger images of near sleep, or whether you are still alert and still following, it has been a good use of time. The best use of time sometimes is sitting with something that you do not yet fully understand and letting it work on you, letting it do what very old mysteries do, which is to change you a little bit toward the kind of person who takes the world more seriously, who looks more carefully, who listens better to what the ground and the water and the stone and the silence have been saying all along. The structures of pre-contact Canada have been saying something for a very long time. What they have been saying is not a single message, not a dramatic revelation, not the kind of thing that resolves cleanly into a sentence or a paragraph. What they have been saying is more like what the land itself is always saying, that time is longer than any single life, that the world is older and more layered and more full of human intention than most of us have been taught to believe, that the knowledge needed to live well in this world has been accumulated over spans of time that dwarf recorded history, and that the people who did that accumulating, who paid the kind of attention that produced the medicine wheels and the stone circles and the carved petroglyphs and the serpent mounds, were doing something real, something worth understanding, something that deserves the full weight of our curiosity and our respect. We owe them that, not as an abstract debt, not as a moral obligation disconnected from any practical consequence, but as a matter of intellectual honesty and historical justice. We owe them the accurate account of what they did, and what they knew and how they lived. We owe the land they shaped an accurate account of how it was shaped. We owe ourselves, as inhabitants of this continent, an accurate account of how long it has been inhabited and what that long inhabitation produced. And we owe the communities whose descendants are still here, still carrying the knowledge and the traditions that connect the present to the deep past, the honest acknowledgement that what they carry is real, is valuable, and is part of the record that the full history of this land requires. That is the work. The long, slow, necessary work of understanding what was here. And it is continuing. Even now, while you are lying in the quiet of wherever you are, and I am speaking into the darkness, and the structures are where they have always been, sitting in the ground and on the water floors, and in the boreal and on the prairie hilltops, that work is continuing. A researcher is writing up results. An elder is speaking with a graduate student who has come to learn. A sonar technician is reviewing anomalous returns from a lake floor survey. A provincial archaeologist is writing a report about a site that doesn't fit the standard classifications. A community is deciding whether to invite outside researchers to investigate something that their traditions have always said was important. The work is continuing, and it will produce results, not all at once, not in a single revelation, but steadily over the years and decades ahead. The picture of pre-contact Canada will become more accurate, more complete, more respectful of the depth and complexity of what was here, and the country that emerges from that picture will be, in an important sense, older than the country we currently know, older and more interesting and more worthy of the attention that its extraordinary history has always deserved. For now, the night is what it is. Wherever you are in it, however far toward sleep you have travelled, the structures are in the ground, the stars are overhead. The silence is doing what the silence always does, which is to hold everything in it, every act and every intention and every piece of knowledge that was expressed in the placing of stones and the raising of earthworks and the carving of images. Hold it all in the patient dark and let it go on being what it is. Evidence of a humanity that was paying attention, that was doing the hard and necessary work of understanding the world it lived in, and that left the record of that work in forms that even 10,000 years of weather has not managed to erase. Good night. The land is ancient, the mystery is real, and there is more light coming, even if it is still a long way off. If tonight's journey into the deep prehistory of Canada has opened something for you, some door into the longer story of this land, Leave a comment wherever you are and whatever time it is. Tell me what you found most surprising. Tell me what you want to know more about. Tell me where in the world you are listening from. The geography of where these stories reach is its own kind of wonder, its own small mapping of how far curiosity travels in the dark. Subscribe if you want to keep following these threads. There are more to follow. The history of North America before anyone wrote it down is one of the longest and least explored stories in human knowledge, and we have only just begun. And if you want to support the making of more of these long, slow journeys into the forgotten past, there is a membership here on YouTube, entirely optional, no pressure. The stories will always be here whether you join or not. But every member helps keep the journey going, and the journey, as tonight has shown, is worth taking. For now, breathe. Let the images dissolve into the softer dark behind your eyes, the stones on the hilltop, the water above the lake floor structures, the cold, patient silence of the boreal, the stars doing what they have always done, moving in their circuits above a land that has been watched and wondered at, and marked and loved for longer than any history has yet recorded. You are part of that history, newer than the stones, yes, but part of the same long story, the story of attention, of curiosity, of the human need to mark and understand and transmit. It has been going on for 10,000 years in Canada, and many times longer in the species. And tonight, you added your own small chapter to it, by listening. Rest now. The history will still be there in the morning, all the way down to its oldest layers. There is a specific kind of evidence we have not yet addressed, evidence that sits at the intersection of archaeology and geological science, and that represents, in some ways, the most striking anomaly in the entire body of material we have been examining. It is the evidence of deliberate fire use in the pre-contact Canadian landscape at scales and in configurations that suggest something quite different from the campfires and cooking fires that archaeology routinely documents. Fire has always been a fundamental technology of human survival on this continent. The ability to start and maintain fire is documented in the archaeological record of Canada, going back to the earliest periods of human presence. And fire management, the deliberate use of fire to modify the landscape, to drive game, to clear undergrowth, to encourage the growth of specific food plants, is well documented across many pre-contact North American cultures. This is not controversial. What is less well known, and what has generated significant quiet interest in the ecological and archaeological communities, is the evidence for fire use at a scale and in a pattern that exceeds any documented case of game driving or forest management. In the boreal transition zone of northern Ontario and Manitoba, there are areas of the landscape that show evidence in the pattern of post-fire forest succession and in the charcoal records preserved in lake sediments of fires that were extraordinarily large, that burned across hundreds of square kilometers in configurations that appear to reflect a spatial logic rather than the random pattern of lightning-caused wildfire. Researchers who have analyzed the charcoal records from lake sediments in these areas have noted that the fire events encoded in the sediment do not have the random, temporal distribution that lightning-caused fire would produce. They cluster in specific periods, at intervals that correspond to what might be interpreted as management cycles, and they produce, in the post-fire landscape, specific successional patterns that favor precisely the species most useful to the human communities that inhabited the region, the berry-producing shrubs, the open parkland that concentrates game, the stands of specific tree species whose inner bark was a food source. This is not proof of anything dramatic, but it raises the same question that the medicine wheels and the lake floor structures raise. How organized was the pre-contact management of this landscape? How extensive was the intentional modification of the Canadian environment by the people who lived in it? And how much of what we now understand as natural Canadian landscape is in fact a managed landscape, shaped over thousands of years of deliberate human intervention that the conventional picture of nomadic hunter-gatherers does not fully account for? These questions are being asked carefully and seriously by ecologists and paleoecologists and historical geographers who are working at the intersection of their disciplines with archaeology and Indigenous knowledge. And the answers that are emerging are consistent with what the structures have been telling us. The pre-contact history of Canada includes a level of intentional, organized, multi-generational landscape management that exceeds anything the standard narrative has attributed to the cultures of the region. The land was shaped, It was shaped by fire and by construction, and by the deliberate management of plant and animal communities over very long periods of time. And the people who shaped it left records of their shaping not only in the obvious structures, the mounds and the wheels and the chambers and the alignments, but in the structure of the landscape itself, in the distribution of plant communities and the pattern of fire history and the orientation of travel corridors and the location of resource concentrations that look natural but are, in significant part, the product of human intention accumulated across thousands of years. Consider what it would mean, practically and specifically, to take this evidence seriously in the context of the national conversation about land and belonging that Canada is currently engaged in. The country is, as it has been for several decades now, wrestling with the legacy of the residential school system, with land rights and treaties, and the specific question of what was taken from Indigenous communities and what might be restored or compensated. These are political and legal and ethical questions of the first importance, and they are being addressed imperfectly and slowly through the mechanisms of law and government and negotiation. But they are also less obviously historical questions, questions about what was here before the taking, about the sophistication and the depth and the organized character of what was disrupted. And those historical questions, the questions that the structures of pre-contact Canada are part of answering, are not separate from the political and legal and ethical questions. They are the foundation of them. The case for taking seriously what was lost depends partly on how well we understand what was there to lose. And what we have been learning, slowly and incompletely and against institutional resistance, is that what was there to lose was far more than the conventional narrative has acknowledged. A people who had maintained a sophisticated astronomical calendar across the northern Great Plains for 4,000 years had developed something of immense intellectual value. A people who had encoded navigational and ecological knowledge in the landscape itself, in stone and earthwork, across the full geographic range of a subcontinent, had created a knowledge system of extraordinary scope and durability. A people whose oral traditions preserved accurate geographic and historical information across spans of time that exceed all of written history, had developed a mode of knowledge transmission that the world has not yet fully understood or properly valued. What was taken when the residential schools took children from their communities and broke the chains of transmission was not simply culture in the vague, imprecise sense in which that word is sometimes used. What was taken was knowledge. Specific, hard-won, irreplaceable knowledge about the land and the sky and the plants and the animals and the patterns of time and season and the relationships between human communities and the world they lived in. Knowledge that took thousands of years to develop and that, once broken in its transmission, cannot be fully recovered. Some of it is still there, still being carried by elders and communities that the residential school system did not fully reach. But some of it is gone, and the recognition of what is gone, the honest accounting of the depth and the specificity of the intellectual loss, is part of what understanding the pre-contact history of Canada requires. There is one more thing I want to tell you about before the silence settles completely. One more thread to follow. It connects everything we have discussed tonight, and it is, in its quiet way, the most important thread of all. It is the thread of what it means that these structures exist, not what they are, not who built them, not how old they are, but what it means, what it implies about the human project, what it suggests about the kind of story we are actually in. When you find evidence that people were paying close and sustained attention to the sky 4,000 years ago, on the prairies of what is now Canada, when you find evidence that they were encoding that attention in stone and earth in forms designed to last, you are finding evidence of something that is fundamental to what human beings are. You are finding evidence of the impulse to understand, the impulse to take the world seriously enough to try to figure out how it works, the impulse to take what you figure out and make it durable, make it transmissible, make it available to people who were not there when the knowledge was won and who will need it after the people who won it are gone. This is science, not science as we practice it now, not science with its instruments and its peer review and its statistical analysis, but the underlying thing that science is, the commitment to attending carefully to the world, to building accurate models of how it works, and to preserving those models in forms that can be tested and corrected and improved by subsequent investigation. The medicine wheel builders were doing this. The people who designed the serpent mound were doing this. The people who placed the stones on the Alpina Amberley Ridge were doing this. They were doing what human beings have always done when they take their intelligence seriously. They were trying to understand the world and to make that understanding last. That the forms in which they did this are unfamiliar to us. That the medium they used was stone and earth and living tradition rather than written text and institutional memory does not make what they were doing any less real or any less rigorous or any less valuable as an intellectual achievement. It makes it, if anything, more impressive because they were maintaining a sophisticated body of knowledge without any of the technological scaffolding that we rely on to maintain knowledge across generations. No writing, no printing press, no digital storage, just memory and ceremony and the physical marks they left in the landscape that a later generation would know how to read. This is the human project, not the project of any one civilization, not the project of any one cultural tradition, not the project of any one time and place, but the project of the species. The project of understanding the world we inhabit and making that understanding available to the people who come after us. Every culture that has ever existed has contributed to this project. Every knowledge tradition that has ever developed, from the astronomical observations of ancient Babylon to the ecological knowledge of the Australian Aboriginal peoples, to the mathematical discoveries of medieval Islamic scholars, to the laboratory science of the 21st century, is part of the same long, unfinished, endlessly ramifying project of understanding. The pre-contact peoples of Canada were part of that project. They contributed to it in ways that we are only beginning to properly understand and properly credit. They developed knowledge of the sky and the land and the water and the animals and the plants and the patterns of time and season and weather that was sophisticated, accurate, and hard-won, developed over thousands of years of careful observation and preserved across generations of careful transmission. And they encoded that knowledge in the landscape itself, in forms that have persisted long enough for us to find them and ask what they mean. What they mean is that the human project is older and wider and more various than the version of it that most of us were taught in school. That the story of human knowledge is not a story that begins in ancient Greece or ancient China or ancient Egypt, though all of those are important chapters. It is a story that begins wherever the first human being paid careful attention to the world and decided that what they had noticed was worth preserving. And in Canada, people were paying that kind of attention and doing that kind of preserving long before any old world civilization had developed to its classical height. This should not be surprising, but it is, because we have been taught a story of knowledge that has a specific geography that locates the origins of systematic inquiry in specific places and excludes others. The pre-contact Americas, in that story, are largely off the map, places where people lived but did not, in the full sense, think. The structures we have been discussing tonight are evidence that the map was drawn wrong, that the thinking was happening here too, that the knowledge was being accumulated and preserved and transmitted here too, that the human project was in full swing on this continent long before the first European arrived to tell the story of it. To know this, to really absorb what it means, changes something. It changes your relationship to the land you are on, whatever land it is. It changes your sense of what the past is, how long it goes back, how much was happening in it that no written record captured. It changes your sense of what human beings are capable of, what we have always been capable of, long before the specific technologies and institutions that we associate with civilization made their appearance. It changes your sense of what is lost when a knowledge tradition is suppressed or destroyed, what richness disappears, what understanding becomes inaccessible, when a language dies, or a culture is forcibly dismantled, or an elder dies without having been listened to in time. And it changes, in a quiet but real way, your sense of obligation. The obligation to take seriously what remains, to invest in understanding what has survived, to ensure that the recovery of what was suppressed is supported rather than further obstructed, to listen, genuinely listen, to the people who carry what is still being carried before it is too late for any more of it to be heard. These are not abstract obligations. They are specific and practical. They require specific actions: funding for collaborative archaeological research, support for Indigenous language preservation, institutional openness to methodologies that take oral tradition seriously as a form of evidence, political will to protect sites from development before they are properly understood, and public awareness of the depth and complexity of what this country's pre-contact history contains. Public awareness is what tonight is about. You are part of it now. You know things about the history of this land that you did not know at the beginning of this conversation. You have been introduced to mysteries that deserve more attention than they have received. You have been invited to care about a history that most people in Canada do not know exists, or know only in the most superficial terms. And that caring, multiplied across however many people will listen to this in the months and years ahead, is itself a form of support for the work that needs to be done. The structures of pre-contact Canada have been waiting a long time for someone to care enough to investigate them properly, to protect them properly, to understand them properly. They are patient. They will wait longer if they need to. But every year that passes, without the investigation being done, without the protection being extended, without the understanding being built, is a year in which some of what might have been understood is lost. Sites are damaged. Elders die. Languages fade further. The window, while it remains open, is narrowing. That urgency, held lightly and without panic, is the appropriate response to what we have been discussing tonight. Held lightly because the structures have survived 10,000 years already and can survive a little longer. Without panic, because the work that needs to be done is long-term work that cannot be rushed without being done badly, but with a genuine sense that it matters, that there is real value at stake, that the question of what is beneath Canada is not a trivial curiosity, but a fundamental question about who we are and what we owe to the full length of the human story on this continent. The night is deep wherever you are. The silence has been gathering for the whole of this conversation, building around the images and the questions and the structures, building toward the moment of sleep that is waiting at the end. You are almost there. The questions will still be there in the morning. The structures will still be there, patient and real, in the ground and in the water, and in the forest, and on the hilltops, and in the memories of the people who have been carrying their meaning forward for longer than any written history. This land has a long memory. The people who have been on it the longest have an even longer one, and the structures that the early dwellers of this land built and marked and aligned and maintained are part of that memory, the part that is preserved in stone and earth rather than in language, the part that does not require translation, because it is written in the most universal alphabet there is, the alphabet of the sky and the land and the relationships between them that are the same for everyone who looks up and pays attention. You have been paying attention tonight. That is enough. That is everything, really, for any one night. Keep paying attention. Keep asking the questions that the comfortable answers do not reach. Keep making room in your understanding for the things that do not fit neatly into the frameworks you were given, because those things are often where the most interesting truths are hiding. The land is old, the history is deep, and it is, all of it, yours, as surely as it belongs to anyone. The whole of what was here, the whole long human story on this continent, is the shared inheritance of everyone who is here now, whatever their ancestry and whatever the path by which they came to be standing on this ground. Understanding that history, taking it seriously, investing in its recovery and its preservation, these are acts of belonging to a place that is older and more complex and more worthy of that belonging than most people have been told. Sleep now, carry it with you, the weight of 10,000 years of human presence on a land that is still full of what that presence built and marked and meant. It is not a heavy weight. It is, when you let yourself feel it, a kind of company, the company of all those people, across all those generations, who paid attention to the same sky and the same land, and the same slow turning of seasons that you are part of right now, in this moment, wherever you are in the dark. You are not alone in time. You never were. The structures on the lake floors and the hilltops and in the forest knew that before you did. And they are still here, still saying it, in the only language they have, the language of stone and earth and the patient, enduring fact of their own existence. Good night. The history is long, the morning will be new, and the questions will still be waiting, as they have always been waiting, for anyone who is ready to ask them.